Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of October 18th, 2020. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party. Today, we hope to have a fascinating conversation about cryonics and cryobiology, about the science, about the philosophy, about the practicalities involved, about some of the financial decisions that might need to be involved in these fields. And we are pleased among the US Transhumanist Party officers to have our secretary, Pavel Ilin, our director of applied innovation, David Shoemaker, our director of scholarship, Dan Elton, our director of visual art, Art Ramon Garcia, and of course our 2020 US presidential candidate, Charlie Kam. And for our guests, we have Rudi Hoffman, who is a financial planner and a life insurance agent, a cryonics advocate, who can tell us a lot about various financial planning considerations involved with cryonics. And we have Matthew Bryce Deutsch, who is a longtime advocate of cryonics. So welcome, Rudi and Matthew. We hope to have an excellent conversation with the two of you today. And let us begin with a presentation by Rudi. This is a presentation that he also delivered at RADFest 2020 in early October, but this time we're opening up the presentation to the general public. Rudi, take it away.
Outstanding. Thank you, everybody. Gennady and Art and Chuck and Dan and Pavel and Matthew and David and whoever else is on this, either live and in person or in the amazing ability to listen to this in a non-real time. Our first mission is to have the get our presentation up here. And so we're going to take a minute to do that. Starting with doing a screen share. As I pull this up, it maybe take a moment to talk about technology and the general concept of technology. As you view this, if you would take a moment to realize how absolutely incredible it is that you can view something like this in real time or non-real time. This very meeting is an example of how technology and convergent technology has enabled stuff that was simply impossible a few decades ago. And I think that's an important idea. So let me take a quick walk through this, and I think this will make pretty good sense. And this was compressed into 10 minutes for the RAD Fest. Of course, most of you know the RAD stands for Revolution Against Aging and Death. And maybe those of you who are viewing wherever you are can take a moment and realize how incredible it is that we are here alive here in the 21st century. Somehow or other, the universe has conspired to put this collection of atoms together that comprises you, and we want that you to be around a long time. So let's talk about the two takeaways I'd like for you to get through from this presentation. One is that cryonics is a legitimate, though currently unproven, life extension strategy, a life extension strategy. And two, that cryonics is generally affordable through the leverage of life insurance. So these are two pretty simple ideas, but we're going to make sure that they get kind of well covered, I believe. First of all, who am I and who am I to make this presentation? Well, I'm very passionate about a couple ideas, and one of it basically is being alive. I think being alive is better than being dead. And by the way, in 2016, I could have been dead. Absent technology, I would be. This is a nice article. You may have, hopefully some of you might have even seen this. This happened to be a nice, they did a profile of me, but they also showed an article I wrote, what I learned from not dying of cancer in 2016. Absent innovation, absent science, absent technology, I would be literally dead because I had a very fast growing form of cancer in my spleen of all places. So basically, I'm signed up for Cryonics, and my wonderful wife Dawn, and our dogs are, this dog right there, I don't know if you can see that, is actually in cryopreserved right now. And many people who are very listening to this may already be wonderful cryonicists or clients. I'm licensed throughout the United States, and the I I believe that the future is going to be even better than the present. And don't think that's too hard for many of us to understand right now. But in general, the arc of humanity progress is pretty obvious if you zoom back far enough and do enough homework. So I was proud to write a couple of books. First one took me a mere 17 years, that book right there. It's called The Affordable Immortal. Maybe You Can Beat Death and Taxes. And literally, as of now, the next few weeks, a second book, The Cryonics Estate Planning Handbook, Maybe You Can Take It With You, will be published. I'm really pretty excited about that because for what, it didn't take me 17 years. It took about 17 months, but it also took about 26 years, really. I've been signed up since 1994 for Alcor. There's my Alcor bracelet. And I'm also a member of the Cryonics Institute. So I'm pretty even-handed when it comes to two major cryonics organizations. The one of the things that's kind of exciting is not only is cryonics real, but increasingly a thing called cryonics estate planning is real, where it may be possible to literally take it with you. And I was really thrilled. It cost me a lot of money. Please be impressed with that cover of that book, because my publisher did a super job pulling that together. I thought that was pretty funny. You may have seen remember the Star Trek show. How many of us are Star Trek fans who are, basically grew up in the 70s and 80s and were science fiction enthusiasts? And I suspect if you're a transhumanist, you also are a science fiction enthusiast. You may remember Dr. McCoy saying, "He's dead, Jim." We have different varieties. He's dead, Jim. Jim, this is a dead man. And then occasionally we'd have Spock saying, "Doctor, is this a dead man?" There was the implication there is that obviously that at one moment you're completely alive, and then boom, a nanosecond later, boom, you are gone. You are totally dead. You are irretrievably, permanently dead. Well, we know that's kind of silly. Death is not an instantaneous thing. It's a continuum. And if we can intervene in that process, we basically may be able to reverse that process. At some point, obviously, it's a cascade of increasingly horrible things that become events that we think at some point irretrievable. But if you can intervene with that, of course, the idea behind cryonics, it's an experimental procedure that preserves living beings using the best available technology for the purpose of saving, I want to say, your future life. And very importantly, this is something I could not get into the RadFest presentation because if I took more than 3 seconds on a screen, I'd gone past my time. But since there's nobody giving me the hook on 10 minutes here, I can talk to you about this. And I'd like to talk to you about the altruistic motives behind being a cryonicist. We want to acknowledge the fact that right now the technology is not reversible. Right now, we cannot prove this thing works. But all those who are cryonicists are not just doing the best to preserve themselves. You're also being part of a movement that basically helps the technology get better. This is an altruistic thing to do, to basically say, maybe I can't solve this big problem of death, but by being a part of this organization, you basically contribute to solving other people's problems, even if we can't save your life. So there is an altruistic motive here that I want to mention, and I think it's important. So once again, take away, the cryonics is legitimate. We can't prove it works yet. I'd love to be able to show you a wonderful picture of a guy who is actually at minus 196 degrees, dead for 15 years, and he's back. Yes, that would be pretty easy to do, and that would be pretty easy, compelling presentation, but it's not real. We believe in a thing called facts. Facts matter, and we want to not get ahead of the science. We want to show you the reality, and the reality is what you already know. There's some ideas here that you are certainly going to agree with, and cryonics is a logical extension of those ideas. Of course, this is a slide of the human condition that has been the human condition for as long as humanity's been around. And quite frankly, is a human condition still. We're all kind of marching toward this chasm of death. And the whole idea behind anti-aging, behind age reversal, behind cryonics is that this is a mechanism to get us across that chasm. And so there's a lot of strong proof for the science of cryonics. And I want to just touch these rather quickly. One, we know that many people walking around today, literally tens of thousands of people, were cryonically preserved. They literally were cryonically preserved when they were very small. And to be fair, freezing single-celled embryos is certainly a whole lot easier, but there are some multicellular organisms that can still survive after being cryopreserved. But a lot of people were fertilized ova, fertilized eggs, and they're walking around today. Importantly, there is some pretty good, although not perfect, proof that brain patterns can be preserved, especially if you happen to be a C. elegans worm. And to be fair, again, most of us have a whole lot more. We have 30 or 40 trillion cells instead of the number of cells in our worm. But the point being this, there was an experiment that was published that showed that the worms kind of remembered their training. We know that right now, therapeutic hypothermia is a thing that basically is mainstream technology currently, where people are cooled down during heart operations and other major operations so that we extend the period of time your brain will not be damaged if your heart and lungs and blood is stopped. And a lot of people have been clinically dead. Here's one of them. This guy is named Jeff Smythe. He was literally in a snowbank for something like 45 minutes with everything stopped. Now, this is not an ideal cryonics circumstance, but it's basically there's multiple, again, proof of concept that if you're cooled down, biological processes simply slow down. We know that it's obvious, and that's why we put the items in the refrigerator. We know that slows down biological processes. And no cryonics presentation would be complete without this well-known slide, the distinction between current vitrification, which basically replaces water with the vitrification solution, the CPA cryoprotective agent. Alcor's is called M22. And what that does, even those of us who are laymen can see the distinction between a lot of ice damage and a vitrified organ. We do know that we hope a gentleman will be on here after me or during me that can talk about in more detail about the actual current technology and how it does preserve structure. There's a lot of organizations working on making this technology and better. Many people obviously are familiar with Alcor and the Cryonics Institute, both fine organizations. Alcor, of course, based in Scottsdale/Phoenix, Arizona. Cryonics Institute, of course, near Detroit, Michigan. A lot of folks are not aware there's some other organizations like Suspended Animation Inc., which is an organization designed to transport people with legitimate medical technology, so your brain does not turn to soup while we're trying to get you preserved. Other less or well-known organizations. One of those is this kind of under the scenes right now, but it's going to be huge, is the Organ Preservation Alliance. And I wanted to be able to talk more about this at the RAD, so I can't talk about this briefly because it's something I would like this group to really be aware of. The Organ Preservation Alliance, by the way, is kind of mainstream. In fact, they're so mainstream that they graciously disinvited me to come to their 2 symposia they've had. I understood because I'm kind of affiliated with Cryonics, and they're trying to be basically talk about a lot of money, big money from big pharma, from DARPA. And matter of fact, I understand they have about $100 million from DARPA to do organ preservation. So anyway, there's a whole lot of exciting things happening behind the scenes that are on the way to reversible cryopreservation. Here's we don't believe in arguments from authority. We believe in trying to give you evidence. But there's 69 scientists who basically said that even with today's technology, there's a reasonable chance that we will preserve sufficient neurological information, prevent restoration of a person to full health. Again, this is the important distinction here that I think this group will appreciate this. There's a difference between pseudoscience and protoscience. I would submit to you that cryonics is the opposite of pseudoscience. We're not trying to make claims we cannot back up. What we can tell you is that this is an early science that basically is a reasonable thing to do now, because if we define preserving structure better than the options, Cryonics works now. We can't, if we define it as bringing people back, we can't do that yet. So we understand that this is a legitimate science, but if it worked 100% of the time, and if it was $500 million or even $50 million or even $5 million, or for some people $5,000 or $50,000, it would be a moot point. So my focus has been for the last 26 years is that this is an affordable gamble. And so let me take a minute and explain the actual the second part, that cryonics is affordable through the leverage of a thing called life insurance. Leverage is pretty magic. Most of the people that are signed up for cryonics use life insurance, not all of them. And to be fair, it's important to understand that not everybody qualifies for life insurance. Most of you understand that life insurance, you have to do it while you're healthy. And that's another point that I did not get across well, I don't think, on the truncated version of this presentation. And that's that if you think you might be interested in cryonics, it sure makes sense to get your insured life insurance in place, even if you make the beneficiary not a cryonics organization. Don't sign up for cryonics yet if you don't not sure of it. But for heaven's sakes, it sure makes sense to jump on a bunch of life insurance, or at least a reasonable amount of coverage, so that the option becomes available to you. Because if while you're thinking about it, you become uninsurable, or only uninsurable at a higher rate, then that changes the metrics. A quick personal story. When I signed up 26 years ago, 1994, my wonderful wife of now 36 years was pretty disinterested in signing up. She was not aggressively dismissive, but she didn't think it would work, and two, all thought it was, a little, just wasn't that interested. But we did something smart, but I want you to think about. We got an extra life insurance policy on her with me as a beneficiary. So you can basically get that policy in place. What that does is open the window so that should you then want to change your mind and become signed up, you can do so simply without the jumping through the hoops for insurability. 5 years later, she did go ahead and sign up. It was a really kind of neat thing. She did it for a Valentine's with a nice little figurine saying together for eternity. It was really quite sweet. But the way that we were able to do that is because we had the insurance in place. So the concept here is to, if in doubt, jump on some insurance. This guy's a young guy, for instance. You get a lot of life insurance if you start with term life insurance. Now, term life insurance is dirt cheap in the early years. However, this guy's got $400,000 of coverage for less than $1 a day. Think about that risk reward ratio. For something like $1 a day to have a chance to maybe see the year 3,000. That's a value proposition that I would submit is pretty strong. Now, to be fair, there's a couple things we should know. One, term insurance, while it's cheap in the early years, is shockingly expensive in later years, which is why most people eventually go with what's called a permanent policy. For instance, you can buy a $300,000 index universal life policy for $185 a month, and that not only has a life insurance death benefit, but also accumulates a tax-free savings component to it. So in this case, at age 100, which would be a few years away for this guy, but he accumulates about $1.7 million. You can also pay those policies off on a shorter term basis. You can pay at a single pay of $65,000, for instance, this 45-year-old single female buying that $300,000 can pay it off in 7 years. Or pay it annually. So there's multiple ways you can pay it. Even the older folks, if they're healthy and insurable, can still usually benefit from the leverage of life insurance. This guy is getting $160,000, which is sufficient to cover the cost of, for instance, full body cryopreservation at the Cryonics Institute, along with transportation piece of suspended animation, along with a private air ambulance to make sure that he actually gets there on a timely basis. His investment's out $7,700 a year, which is a pretty substantial amount of money, to be fair. But meanwhile, $7,700 a year is less than many people are paying for other items that don't have the kind of potentially good outcome this might. And the big deal this year is we now can redirect existing funds. A lot of folks don't want to qualify for, can't qualify for life insurance, or they got money and they simply don't want to. You can now control your assets in a variable annuity, have a guaranteed death benefit that increases no matter what by 5% each year, or the actual growth on the account, which, by the way, has averaged about 14% for the last 10 years and about 12% for the last 15 years, which is pretty good tax-free growth with a safety net of a guarantee on there. So we're pretty excited about this new modality that will enable people who've got some money to reposition to be able to get covered without having to jump through insurance hoops. So this is obviously a bridge that's still a bit in process, but eventually it's going to be a well-built bridge. And I would like to encourage you to join us in the amazing future that could be ours. So there's our takeaways reviewing. Cryonics is affordable through life insurance. And if you would like a copy, and this is for any of you, including watching on video, if you send me an email to rudy@rudihoffman.com, we will send you a PDF of this book for the low price of free. Even tightwad cryonicists can afford such a number. You can also we encourage people to do their homework. Most people who are signed up for Cryonics have done it, done a tremendous amount of homework, tremendous amount of thinking about this, tremendous amount of research. But the actual mechanics to actually get some quotes is simply go to rudyhoffman.com and fill out a website form. So that is the official close, a moment of drama here. We all have moments in which you kind of make a decision. And I would not be doing my job if I would not encourage people, even those of us who think of ourselves as rationalists, still have emotional decision components in our brain. And a secular come to Jesus moment is that if I could look from my heart to your heart and encourage you to check this option out to see if it may be a fit for you. Maybe you don't take action on it for even a couple of weeks. Maybe you don't take action on a couple of months. Maybe you get your insurance in place just so you provide the option, but you still don't take action on the cryonics piece for a couple of years. But if it does work and you've made a decision to do it, think about how remarkable that could be. So I want to, from my heart to yours, to our future selves, it's great to be with you. And we'll now go ahead into their question mode. I need to turn the screen back to Art. So let's see, stop that screen and change the screen share to participants and give Art back the host mode. Yes, there we go.
All right. Thank you very much, Rudi, for that presentation. It was eloquent and insightful. There is a question from our viewers. Mike Lazine asks, with regard to the cryonics organizations that you mentioned, to your knowledge, are any of these organizations working on suspended animation for future space travel as well?
Oh, what a great question. Hi, and you're going to field the questions, Gennady, is that correct? You're going to field them and then feed them whether to me or whoever else, is that correct?
Yes, I'll field the questions and comments from the chat, but we'll also have live questions from the U.S. Transhumanist Party officers. We'll kind of intersperse them.
Outstanding, thank you. And thank you. I love the eloquent, and what was those two words? Like nice descriptors, eloquent and something or other.
Eloquent and insightful.
Oh, can I put that on my resume? Thank you. Yeah, the question about space travel is certainly a good one. I think there are many of us who understand, future of humanity issues, realize that in order to get to the vast distances, I'm looking at behind Dan Elton. If we're going to go to the stars, we simply can't do it in a single lifetime. So some type of suspended animation is certainly a component of future space travel. I would not say that Alcor or the Cryonics Institute are working specifically on that. They are working on basically figuring out ways to minimize damage on the front end and making sure that the organization is super stable for as long as it takes to be. And also they're working on, beginning to work on resuscitation technologies, which could basically, of course, be applied to space travel later. And so that is the answer. They're working on reversible cryopreservation, which could be used here on Earth, or if we're going to hop to the stars.
Excellent. Thank you, Rudi, for your answer. And One of our viewers, Taylor B, wrote, Rudi knows what's up. Well, we could say space is up. So indeed, by answering that question, you have demonstrated your knowledge of what is up. Now let us go to our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers. Who among you has a question for Rudi?
Well, I wanted to clarify, just a simple clarification on the life insurance. When you said you set it up early as an option, do you mean you would take that existing plan and then change the beneficiary? Or would you get a whole new plan?
Yes, thank you, Dan. That's a good question. I'm happy to be able to clarify that. So let's a lot of folks, many of the people who are listening to this, including the transhumanist officers here, are not just tremendously intelligent; they're tremendously educated, and I certainly, in many areas of life, you guys know a whole bunch more than I do. I happen to know a whole bunch about this arena, and the area of life insurance is something that most people don't necessarily want to know that much about. But to answer your question, Dan, you can get a life insurance policy, name your spouse or significant other or girlfriend, boyfriend, an organization, family, loved ones as beneficiaries. But then if you later decide to sign up with a cryonics organization like the Cryonics Institute or Alcor, you can then redirect all or a part of those life insurance proceeds.
Right.
And so basically, to answer your question, it keeps the policy. It's the same policy. You're simply redirecting the life insurance proceeds. You maintain the full control of who gets the money when you die. And so that can be then redirected to, was that responsive to your question, Dan?
Yeah, no, I wasn't 100% clear because you mentioned, being qualified for another plan and such. So I just wanted to make sure that's how it'll be done. And I think for those of us who are younger, like Gennady and myself, and really a lot of us here, it's good to lock in those lower rates, right?
Yes, both your rates while you're younger and lower, you can lock those in, and you also lock in your current good health. A lot of us, let's face it, we all think of ourselves as smart, rational decision makers, and those of us who read a lot, and I suspect the people who are listening to this are readers and researchers, and we really want to think we're making good decisions, but the reality is, it's hard to, this is a really easy thing to put off. This is such an easy thing to put on the back burner. And a whole lot of you probably listening to this have thought about, I'll probably get to this at some point, but I'm going to wait till I get old. I want to wait till I'm, till this crisis du jour is away from me, till I get the goddamn election over or some other issue. The reality is there's never a good time to take action. The reason I have such tremendous respect for my cryonics clients, and I have thousands, is because they have done what most people do not do. They have taken action on their own behalf, even not knowing the full total consequences of that, but simply they've been able to overcome their cryocrastination, which is a nice word for the phenomena of putting this decision making and taking action on this is so widespread among smart, progressive, transhumanist oriented human beings that there's even a name for it. So avoiding cryocrastination is one of the challenges that I help people get through. And so was that responsive at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Great. So we now have several other questions from the chat. Daniel Twet asks, could a group of people buy a policy and have it applied to one person in a lottery style format to lower the cost? Now, I can answer part of that question. This is a concept
you can.
Eerily similar to what was called a tontine back in the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy. They had this concept of essentially a group life insurance policy that paid a death benefit. It paid a certain fixed benefit to people as long as they were alive. And then whenever somebody died, the remaining pool that would have gone to that person was kind of split evenly among the remaining participants. So if 5 people were alive, then they would get 1/5 of the benefits. If one of them died, then each person would get 1/4 of the benefits. If the next person died, then each surviving person would get 1/3 of the benefits. This created a very perverse incentive, and it actually led to some murders in what were the Italian city-states at the time. So tontines have generally been outlawed as a result of this incentive problem. Now, this concept that Daniel Twett articulates is a little bit different, but keep in mind, I think it runs afoul of the same issues, because if you have a lottery, you have a certain probability that one person will get the benefit. So if you have X people, 1 out of X is the probability. If you have X minus 1 people, 1 divided by X minus 1 is a larger probability that each individual would get it. So if you get into a group of people and the benefit can only apply to one of them, you've all of a sudden created an incentive for the other people to essentially be interested in your speedy demise. Rudi, do you have anything to add to that?
I love that. Needless to say, Gennady answers that question like an actuary. I'll answer it with less nuance. No. How about no? But here but what you're thinking there is a reasonable thinking there, which is basically a risk sharing. But that's what life insurance is. The neat thing about what you can do here with a traditional life insurance policy is you can take advantage of the fact that most of our Cryonics clients are really pretty smart people. They typically don't do things that are dangerous. They don't do things that are risky. Most of us don't do chain, very few of us are chain smokers. I think I have a few folks who are smokers, but very few of us are, chain smokers with traditional cigarettes putting tar into your lungs. Very few of us, but many of us wear life belts, basically take vitamins, do the kind of things that help you be in a good risk pool. The cool thing about new life insurance programs is they have segmented the population to where you're now not in a risk pool with people who weigh 350 pounds and stay home and eat junk food all day long watching daytime TV. You can be in a risk pool with great healthy people, and the main carrier I work with has actually like 8 or 10 different health categories, and most of our Cryonics clients qualify for really among the top of those health categories, which reduces your rate, your internal cost of insurance. So you're doing the very idea you talked about, Daniel, but with a larger group of people who you don't have to as Gennady suggested, you don't have to do these people in to improve your benefit.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Rudi. Now, Taylor B asks, how has COVID-19 impacted premiums, if at all, for life insurance? And that's an interesting question because, of course, mortality rates have spiked, especially for certain demographics as a result of COVID-19.
Taylor, first of all, brilliant, absolutely brilliant question. I promise you it's something. This is the opposite of a theoretical question. This is a super pragmatic, realistic question. To answer the question, that not actually increased rates, as counterintuitive as that might be. And that's not because life insurance companies don't care about the COVID-19. It's because they have to get each rate approved in various states. And like my main carrier is licensed in 49 states. Every time they change a product rate, has to be approved. So what they can't do is change the rate. What they can do is tighten down the underwriting. That fat thing right there is a list of about 28 people that right now are in process trying to get life insurance for. I've been selling life insurance for 42 years, and it's weird, really surreal for me to say that. It must be a geezer. But I've been, because I taught a couple of years before that. But for the last 42 years, I've been doing life insurance and investments and financial planning. I have never seen the underwriting as tight as it is right now. So they can't actually change. They haven't changed the rates. The rates are the same, but there's a pretty good chance that unless you're pretty healthy, you might not. Very few people are getting preferred rates anymore. Most what we're getting is standard. And so I used to just kind of quote for our healthy non-smoking cryonicists, I'd go to my go-to rate was a preferred rate. And now I'm, since they're coming back after underwriting at standard, I'm now quoting standard because it's psychologically difficult to say, hey, listen, it's going to be out 8% more than I thought it was going to be. And that's always awkward for me and awkward for the client. So the answer is it has not actually changed the rate. It does mean that you really need to be super healthy if you're going to get a standard or preferred rate. Hopefully that was pretty responsive.
Yes, indeed. So essentially what has been happening now is while the rates have remained largely stable, how you get put into a rating classification has changed, and that's the underwriting. So the insurer decides whether you go into group X or group Y, and the rates are set for group X and group Y. But if Y is more preferred than X and you get into X, you're going to pay a higher premium than if you got into Y.
As a sales professional, I prefer to say, if you qualify for an even better rate, we'll get you the preferred rate. One nice thing is that the main carrier I'm working with actually understands the whole cryonics thing. Most insurance carriers do not understand that at all, and that's a reasonable segue to this really important concept. And I'm not, this sounds like trying to make some kind of a USP, unique selling proposition here. But it turns out the actual reality is of the 7,000 insurance carriers out there, most of them will not accept cryonics organizations as either beneficiaries, and what they really won't do is accept cryonics organizations as owners or joint owners, which is what the cryonics orgs actually require. Now, so there's a couple that will, and the main carrier I work with will actually do the best of all possible structuring, which is joint ownership, where basically you, as John Jones, as the insured, you're the owner, but also Alcor or the Cryonics Institute is listed as a joint owner. Well, people say, well, I don't know about that. That sounds a little iffy. There's a document that clarifies you maintain full control of your policy. You can redirect the policy proceeds. You call the cash value that grows in the policy is directly go benefit you, not the cryonics organization. If you want to change your mind, you can certainly do that. However, all the stakeholders have to sign off to have that happen. So basically what it does is protect all the stakeholders of cryonics organizations, as well as you and the cryonics life insurance issuer from liability, because that way everybody has to be completely clear in documented form about what has happened. So if you get a life insurance policy, by the way, I have $3 million of life insurance on me. Please be impressed. It's a lot of life insurance. 11 total policies. I pay literally tens of thousands of dollars a year for my life insurance policies. Not because I'm wealthy, unfortunately. It's because I understand the benefit and leverage of life insurance. And also the cash accumulation can grow tax-free, which is a big deal. And I also want $3 million to have the best of all possible cryopreservations, make sure my wonderful wife and doggies are taken care of, and also have money going into a different idea called the Cryonics Trust, an individual trust that is designed to accumulate and grow money, and that can be funded through the leverage of life insurance. So I'm going through a few ideas there, and I don't want to go too fast, but the whole idea being life insurance is something you should probably jump on because it's a smart investment and to take care of your family, even without the cryonics piece. But having that cryonics piece and being able to open that window to know that you can have that extra coverage in place that you personally own and control. And this is not your group life insurance. If you got access to group life insurance, you need to have a bunch of it. It's great. It's subsidized. It's cheap in the early years. Many of you may work for companies that give you $250,000 or $500,000 of group life insurance. That's fabulous. It's not applicable and will not work for cryonics funding, but it's good you got that coverage. But what you want for your cryonics funding is a policy you personally own and control that ideally is in a permanent, what's called index universal life format, where it's not just cheap now for the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, and then the premium goes to the sky, but will actually pay itself after about 15 or 20 years. And that's called a whole, not the old traditional whole life, but the more modern index universal life. That index universal life has a cash value component where that cash value is growing at a rate that's determined by the Standard & Poor 500 index, historically about a 7.25% tax-free. So sorry for that. Didn't mean to go off on a rant there, but there it is.
Well, thank you, Rudi, for your answer. By the way, we have our special mystery guest who is waiting to be let in the waiting room. So if we could check to see if he can be admitted, we may be experiencing a few technical
can you magically
issues.
let our mystery guest in?
I don't see him yet.
Interesting. Well, I will correspond with him behind the scenes. Now, let me ask Rudi another question. Do you think the reason that the majority of insurance companies, life insurers, are not comfortable with cryonics organizations as beneficiaries is the idea of insurable interest? That essentially they don't think the cryonics organization is sufficiently related to the individual in question as to have a legitimate financial interest if that person is legally deceased.
Well, what a nice question. And I like the way that you summarized the insurable interest concept there. Oh, good deal. I think the doctor is in the house. Good deal. Hi, Greg.
Sorry, yeah. Hi.
Let me just briefly answer this, and we'll give it back to Gennady to run. But yeah, the insurable interest question is something that often comes up when talking to insurance carriers. They don't understand the concept behind cryonics. The big factor is it feels for lack of a better word, flaky to them. It feels like a lawsuit magnet. There's another term you may have heard of called reputation risk. And if you're a big XYZ corporation and you basically live and die on, what your reputation, if it's something that even has a small chance of impacting that reputation negatively, you look at it pretty carefully. And to be fair, the good news is we have developed an excellent relationship with a handful of carriers who do kind of get it, and their rates are great. And that insurable interest question does not come up because they understand that people have insurable interest in their own lives. And I'll now give it back to Gennady. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rudi, for your thoughtful answers to the questions that were posed thus far. And we will continue some of this discussion later on in our salon. But right now, let me introduce our mystery guest, who is no longer a mystery. He is Dr. Gregory Fahy. He is one of the world's leading cryobiologists in the area of organ banking. He has received wide recognition for his work in that area. He is widely published. He is the executive director of 21st Century Medicine, and he can tell us a lot about the preservation of brains and other organs, given what is known in cryobiology today. And I think it's a great honor to have Greg here with us to discuss some of the comments that were previously made at the Virtual Enlightenment Salon with Dr. Ken Hayworth and Dr. Robert McIntyre. And they were a bit skeptical about conventional cryopreservation, at least the techniques that are available today, working with preserving the structure and the contents of the brain, so the memories that are encoded within the brain. But let's get your scientific opinion, Greg, about conventional cryopreservation techniques. What can they do? What are they not able to do today with regard to preserving the structures of the brain?
Right. Well, thanks, Gennady. It's very good to be here and to have a chance to deal with questions like this. So as you point out, I'm the executive director of 21st Century Medicine. We have a program there which allows us to investigate brain cryopreservation along with our other projects. And we've been doing this for a number of years. I have met Dr. Hayworth and Mr. McIntyre in the past. And obviously, Mr. McIntyre did his work in our lab that was responsible for the publication of the Ask paper in cryobiology. And so I'm pretty familiar with the arguments on both sides of this issue. What bothers me a little bit is that I have shared unpublished micrographs with these two individuals demonstrating superb ultrastructural preservation of the brain after perfusion with M22, which they did not dispute. And it bothers me that they're not relaying any of that information to you. It's perhaps related to the fact that they have a certain point of view that they're trying to advance, or more generously, perhaps it's because I just showed them micrographs which I believe are representative, but we didn't do the sort of Ken Hayworth maneuver and the McIntyre maneuver of doing 50,000 serial sections and tracing every neuron in every direction for several microns or millimeters through the tissue. That's beyond our capability. But I didn't see anything that contradicted the micrographs that I've generated. So the problem starts off with the fact that brains have a blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is very important physiologically because the brain is like a computer. So I remember when I was at the Red Cross, we installed this big computer in the company. And in order to do that, they built a special room for the computer. And the air was purified and the humidity was controlled and the temperature was controlled. Everything set up in a perfect environment for all these computations. And that's exactly the way the brain is. The brain has to have a controlled environment around all those neurons. And the way it does that is it sets up the blood-brain barrier, and nothing gets through that the brain doesn't benefit from. And unfortunately, the brain was never evolved to desire to have a lot of cryoprotective agents going into it. So cryoprotective agents, which are essential for preservation, have a hard time going through the blood-brain barrier. They do go through, but they go through slowly. And water goes through the blood-brain barrier quite rapidly. So every time you reduce water concentration by putting something else around, like a cryoprotectant, which displaces water on one side of a semi-permeable membrane, and you have lots of water on the other side of that membrane, and the water replacement agent can't cross that membrane, then water does what water will do. It diffuses across that membrane to dilute what's on the other side so that the water concentration will be the same on both sides. What that means in this case is that water in the brain has to leave the brain, go to the vascular system, and be perfused out. And eventually, if you could wait forever, the cryoprotectants would diffuse into the brain and replace as much water in the brain as it did in the perfusion solution, but that takes a long time. So in practice, what you see when you perfuse a brain with cryoprotective agent, and we published on this a long time ago, I think 1984 was the first time we published on this, when we were doing collaborative research with NIH, and they wanted better brain cryopreservation for some testing they were doing. We saw in the rat brain that there's nothing you could do that would prevent the brain from shrinking down to about half of its size, unless you perfuse it with something like methanol, which could cross the blood-brain barrier, but probably was not very good for the brain. So this is still largely true today, although at 21st Century Medicine, we're now discovering agents that can penetrate the blood-brain barrier pretty fast, which is pretty exciting. We're going to be doing everything we can to follow up on that. But M22, which is the flagship solution that we use to preserve kidneys, and which seems to be better even for brain tissue than alternative solutions, that does not go across the blood-brain barrier very quickly. And so if you perfuse a rabbit brain, which is our traditional brain model, with M22, which is a necessity if you want to preserve it, you're going to get some brain shrinkage. In fact, you'll see the brain weight reducing by almost a factor of 2. And the problem that creates, if you're a Ken Hayworth or a traditional neurobiologist, is that what you see now when you look at that brain is not what you're expecting. Everything looks different. I had a similar experience when I was in graduate school. I was freezing kidney tissue to dry ice temperature and having a look at it in the microscope. And at first I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It looked so different. You have these big white spaces and everything, and you have to reorient your thinking. After a while, you learn how to understand and interpret dehydrated tissue. So for me, when we started doing this many years ago, and I saw the tissue dehydrated, it didn't really bother me at all because I knew that the structure is likely there. And there's this classic experiment in cryobiology in which people were doing experiments such that either ice formed inside cells or ice formed outside cells. And with rapid cooling, ice formation inside the cell doesn't look that bad if you look at it, the cell in a micrograph. But those are the cells that die when you warm them back up again. And the cells that have ice forming only extracellularly, which shrinks them down to nothing, they're very, very compressed and distorted looking in the frozen state. Those are the ones that survive when you warm them back up again. So brain shrinkage really just did not bother me. It just was a given, and I resolved that we would work on ways of preventing it over time, which has taken much longer than I wanted and expected, but we've been able to describe methods recently that seem to accomplish that pretty well, and we're going to be following up in even more detail going forward. But so the current issue is, if you do use a technique, a conventional technique, a technique similar to what's been used for the last 20 years or so for cryoprotecting the brain, and you see brain shrinkage, is that brain shrinkage destroying structure or isn't it? And so we had to verify that what I have thought all along is true. So how do you do that? And the way that you do that is a little bit tricky. So if you just wash all of the cryoprotective agent out of the brain, then you'll see damage to the brain. But again, as I say, cryobiology is a little bit tricky because same thing that causes the brain to shrink when you perfuse it with a high concentration will cause it to swell when you perfuse it with a low concentration. And that swelling creates damage, which is not present in the original brain. So you have to be very careful about how you wash it out. So we found out many years ago that we could wash all of the cryoprotective agent out of the brain and not show any of this damage caused by water uptake. But that was using an agent which is known as an osmolyte to prevent the swelling of the brain. And at the time, I used more osmolyte than necessary. So even after washing all of the cryoprotective agent out, the brain looked just as shrunken as it did in the presence of the cryoprotectant. And so you still didn't have a real answer to the question. So what we've been doing over the last few years is washing the cryoprotectant out slowly with or without an osmolyte and with more mild concentrations of osmolyte so we don't overdo the protection. And what this has resulted in is a series of brains that have been looked at when they've been reduced in concentration by about 10%, 2/3, 50%, and in larger percentages. So we can gradually see the brain structure reappearing as shrinkage is reversed, but as swelling does not replace shrinkage, thereby causing another artifact. So we find the sweet spot. So M22, for those of you who know something about chemistry, is 9.3, basically a 9.4 molar cryoprotective agent. That's a very concentrated solution. And we have to wash it out to about 5 molar or so, which is something like 60% of the original concentration to really deswell the brain to the point where the ultrastructure looks good. When you do that, the ultrastructure looks very good. And then if you open the blood-brain barrier with SDS, as Yuri Pichugan learned how to do many years ago, then you see ultrastructure that's even more beautiful. And so the short answer to my very long-winded explanation of what we've seen is that the ultrastructure is preserved after M22 perfusion. That shrinkage does not destroy the structure. It just makes it harder for neurobiologists to recognize and trace. But when you restore hydration of the brain to something that restores brain volume to something approximating the norm, then you see that the ultrastructure comes back to something approximating the norm as well. So I could elaborate a little bit on that, but before I do, I should pause in case anybody has any questions about what I've said so far, just to make sure what I've said so far is not completely opaque.
Yes, thank you. So essentially, there is already experimental evidence that suggests that one can shrink a cell and then essentially thaw it and have it remain functional after that time.
Absolutely. Essentially, cryoprotectants first came onto the scene in a big way in 1949. That was the time at which glycerol was found to protect rooster sperm from freezing and thawing. But we know now from cryobiology that those rooster sperm would have been very, very dehydrated. And almost all cells are frozen in a way very similar to that original experiment. You put in about 10% DMSO or 10% glycerol, you freeze and thaw, and you remove about 60% of the water, 70% of the water, even more water during the course of freezing, and those cells shrink down to something almost unrecognizable. And yet, magically, when you thaw the ice and the water goes back into the cells, that the cells are alive. I remember one of the most magical experiences I ever had was watching human sperm thaw on a cryo microscope. And as soon as the ice goes away and the water goes back into the sperm, they start moving again. You can see life just coming back, really, really exciting. So yeah, so shrinkage is not a problem. Now you can shrink too much. If you freeze cells with too little cryoprotectant, then they shrink beyond the point of no return. But the shrinkage that we see with brains is nothing close to that level of shrinkage.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. And in the chat, Ken Hayworth wrote, "I just want some evidence that will impress my neuroscience colleagues." And he furthermore writes, "I hear you, and I want to accept that it is just shrinking. And I'm very glad to hear that you are still working on these reversal of shrinkage experiments. I want you to know that I will champion these results with my colleagues when you publish them." So that seems to be a sincere openness on his part.
That's great.
To
I appreciate that.
these kinds of results.
Good.
Now,
for that comment.
Is he saying that the neuroscience community more broadly might have some reluctance in accepting these results, at least initially, because they have this preconception that perfect preservation of the brain would have to look like essentially the brain prior to preservation without the shrinkage?
I think what he's saying is that the neurobiologists, like all scientists on all topics, they want to see your evidence, right? And we haven't published the evidence yet. So everything I've just told you is hot air until we actually get it into print. That means it has to pass peer review. I know how to do that. I've done that many times. So I'm very confident our results will get published. We're still putting a couple of final touches on a few of the experiments. We're still reviewing all the micrographs, but we know what we've seen, and the paper is partly written already. I fully expect to finish the paper by the end of the year and send it in. And if all goes well and we get lucky, maybe we'll be able to publish it as soon as the first quarter of next year. It all depends. The process of peer review can take variable amounts of time. So we'll just have to see how long that takes. But I think the point is that we have to publish so people can examine the evidence in great detail and criticize it any way that they can, and give me a chance to respond to any criticism. That's the way science works. That's the way science should work, and I'm absolutely fine with that.
Yes, thank you for that elaboration, Greg. It seems that essentially, once you're able to get this paper through peer review and published, there will be new evidence for the neuroscience community to consider. So we look forward to that. Ken Hayworth says that is fantastic. Great. And science, of course, is essentially defined as an open-ended enterprise that makes progress through a rigorous method. And then Rudi Hoffman writes in our Zoom chat, "We are all in agreement that evidence is king, and I'm deeply aware that we don't have as much as a mouse back from full cryopreservation. However, the idea that we should not be enabling humans to, in a fully informed consent manner, sign up to existing cryonics is probably wrongheaded. And I think Rudi is responding to some of the comments made by Ken Hayworth at the prior virtual Enlightenment Salon. Now, there has been a question in our chat from Mike Lazine with regard to the technology that you used for brain preservation in your experiments. Greg, can it be applied to the whole human body, or would there need to be a different approach to different organs, different parts of the body?
So one of the things that we have done is to explore that question in a couple of different ways. We have a whole pig model that we have perfused with cryoprotective agents. We've gotten a lot of very interesting data from that model, which implies that our technology can be applied to whole bodies. But for this present conversation, the most important question is about the brain. And number one, pig brains have a special problem because we think of the state of their lipids, which is different from our lipids. Their lipids are saturated much more than ours are. And that made it very complicated to cryopreserve pig brains very well. But we were able to overcome that problem by perfusing the pig brains with cryoprotectants at higher temperatures than we normally would. It's a fairly complicated procedure, but it just adjusts for the species difference between other mammals and pigs. And bottom line is we can get pretty good electron micrographs off of pig brains that have been perfused with M22. The bigger question, and really the more important question, is there any evidence that human brains can be preserved in a way similar to our pig and rabbit brains? And we had a chance to test that question a while back. This will be part of the paper that we'll be publishing hopefully next year. And I hope it will help advance the debate about whether these sorts of technologies are appropriate or not. But what we found, we had a situation in which somebody wanted to have his brain preserved, and he provided informed consent for that, but he didn't have money to cover costs, which is the way these things usually work. And I was able to work out an arrangement whereby, in exchange for preserving his brain, he would not have to pay anything for that, as long as he donated his brain to science in a more rigorous way than is usually done. So what he had to agree to is to have his brain removed after it was perfused with M22, which you would normally never do for good reason. But we had to do that so we could detect whether the brain cracked when it was cooled to -140 or not, which is low enough to bank a brain for as long as you would ever want. And the other thing he had to consent to was to have biopsies taken from the surface of the brain so we could look at the brain histology and the brain ultrastructure, and also at brain cryoprotectant uptake. And he agreed to all of these things, and the experiment was performed. And over the course of time, I was able to obtain those samples. And over the course of further time, I was able to analyze some of them. We still have some left. I'd like to do more analyses and see if we can learn more from them. But the first bottom line from those experiments was, and of course, we had no idea what we were going to see. This had never been attempted before. And what we saw, first of all, on the light level was just micrograph after micrograph after micrograph after micrograph of intact brain tissue. There's no ice damage anywhere. So I thought that the brain biopsies, by dropping him into room temperature fixative or into cold fixative, and if there's not enough cryoprotective agent and it's sampled when you do something like that, it may turn white when you're warming it back up, which is ice formation that you can actually see. And I didn't see any ice formation. When it warmed back up, that was a good sign. And when we looked at the microscopic structure of the brain, there were no holes in the tissue that would be induced by ice formation. That was great. And we also stained the brain pretty intensely to bring out all the molecular background structure that we could. And we got very dense staining of these brain samples. So it looked clear that we weren't missing any little patchy areas that might have not made it through the process. But light microscopy can be deceiving. Sometimes things can look great on the light level and look awful on the electron level. So we followed that up with electron microscope images. And again, we didn't see any ice artifacts. The tissue was shrunken because nothing had been done to prevent the shrinkage. And normally that prevents you from seeing the structure very well. And the only remedy that we had available up front was to just increase the magnification so you could see the structures even though they were much smaller than usual. And you can see the structures appear to be intact from what I can tell, and you see synapses all over the place. So from what we could tell up front, it looks like what's true in humans. What's true in humans is the same as what's true in the animal models that we've looked at. It looks like the structure is intact. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to work on now is to take some of those biopsies and figure out a way of diluting them to reduce some of the shrinkage to bring out the ultrastructure better, just as we did in the rabbit model. That's tricky because this tissue has been through 3 hours of post-mortem exposure. It's been through cryoprotectant exposure. It's now loaded with 9 molar CPA. And if we want to dilute it, how do we do that, and wait long enough for the water to come back in without killing the tissue? What temperature do we do that at, et cetera? So we have some problems to work through to figure out how to do that correctly, but I still have ambitions to do that. But at least based on what we've already seen and what we're planning to publish, we have evidence that the structure is preserved not only in cryoprotected animal brains, but also in cryopreserved human brains.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
I had 2 brief questions. First of all, I think this is really important work that you're doing, and I think it's very exciting just for long term that humanity developed these, that we show that these technologies are possible.
Thank you.
I guess my concern is it possible that, say, these synapses, which, that the precise, one of the dominant theories in neuroscience is that the memories are stored in the connectome and the precise connections. Is it possible that some of those connections could get shifted around, or some of those dendrites could get detached during the shrinkage?
They're not shifted around. They're not detached. There's a danger if you shrink something too much and in an uncontrolled way that maybe you could rip cell connections apart, but we see no evidence for that sort of thing so far. So I haven't seen anything that would lead me to conclude that we've done anything bad to the connectome. We still need to do more thorough research. I think Ken has volunteered to do some serial sections for us to help piece together the 3-dimensional structure in more detail. That really should be done, and I'm happy to send him some samples whenever I have enough time to get around to this. What we've seen so far does not give me any reason to think that there's been any change. I mean, the synapses that we see look like synapses. They don't look like half a synapse.
Or you don't see things that are detached.
No.
Necessarily.
No.
Okay. Yeah.
I will say that we did one experiment in which as I mentioned briefly, if you want to stop the brain from shrinking in the first place, which is a really good idea in theory, you can permeabilize the blood-brain barrier, let the cryoprotectants through. The issue that you then have is, okay, so now they can get through the blood-brain barrier, but can they actually get into the cells? Because if they don't get into the cells, you have the same problem, except that now you may expand your extracellular space a little bit because of the blood-brain barrier and make things worse. And I think that, we had one experiment that we did, which looked like the blood-brain barrier was open, so the brain didn't shrink, but we still saw a lot of shrunken brain cells and a lot of empty space inside the brain, which is just shrinkage space. And that I don't want to see. I want everything to look normal and uniform everywhere. And you can imagine that in that kind of scenario, you might be able to distort the connectome, but we didn't actually see any evidence of that.
Oh, I see. If there's inhomogeneity in the
exactly. It's the inhomogeneity that's the issue, not the shrinkage per se. Yeah. But but even then, I didn't actually check the connectome in that experiment. But I doubt it was disrupted. But that's the only case that I would see for it.
Another thing I was curious about is whether there's a role here for expansion microscopy.
There is.
There
is. Yeah, so I talked about,
I think that came up in the last Cryonics Salon. I think Robert McIntyre mentioned that as a, something that could help possibly.
Yeah, I talked with Ed Boyden about this, and he was interested. He was willing to try it. And I was even considering including some experiments like that in the paper that we want to publish, especially on the human material. But there's a lot of complexities involved in applying that in this situation. So I think we're going to hold back on that, and maybe I can talk to Ed later and we can do that in a separate paper. Maybe
that makes sense.
Devoted to human brain tissue, which
I think it add a lot of extra complexity and make that paper harder to interpret.
It would, and it gets starting to get too big, and people won't read it if it's too long. So
I think people just want to see those pictures and the side by side kind of.
Exactly. I think what we need to do first is just demonstrate the proof of principle. Just prove the basics, and then we'll see if we can add more evidence on top of that. Yeah, but it's a really good question. Expansion microscopy is an amazing technique, and it would be very helpful to see detail in brains that are otherwise too shrunken to make out very well. So we'll see. Great question.
All right. So incidentally, Robert McIntyre has joined us in the chat. So he is among the audience as well. And he was involved in a discussion with Daniel Twett on whether cryoprotectants can preserve microtubules in the brain. So Daniel Twett, he seems to be an adherent of the hypothesis that consciousness is related to quantum effects in the cellular microtubules, which are about 0.3 nanometers across. And he asked, has microtubule cryogenic degradation been observed? And Robert responded by saying that microtubules tend to spontaneously disassemble during cryoprotection, then reassemble on warming. And he also says there's no evidence that important information is stored in microtubules. So what are your thoughts on that, Greg? Do you agree with Robert in his answer?
I do. I think Robert is exactly right. And I don't think that the other theory really holds any water. But at the same time, I remember we had a seminar at 21st Century Medicine circa 2002, and I seem to recall showing some micrographs at the time in which the microtubules were actually preserved, or maybe they were just microfilaments rather than microtubules. But cryoprotectants tend to stabilize microtubules, maybe not perfectly, so even if there were something to that, it still wouldn't be a complete loss. But Robert is fundamentally correct. I think it's a non-issue.
All right,
actually,
thank you.
Non-issue.
So we have two related questions. One comes from Rudi Hoffman, who is curious about where the tech is at in terms of reversible organ preservation for organs other than the brain. And David Wood asks a more specific question along these lines. Is there an update to the experiments with rabbit kidneys, vitrifying them and then raising their temperature again? What functionality can be reliably demonstrated afterward?
All right, so there's actually two questions there. One is a broader question about organs in general, and the other is a specific question about kidneys in particular. So as far as organs in general is concerned, in 1980, I was able to list 3 dozen organized tissues and even a few organs that had shown reasonable signs of recovery after cryopreservation. That was 1980. Now, the whole organs that were involved were things like intestine. So you can take a dog intestine, freeze it in liquid nitrogen, and thaw it out and transplant it, and it will survive. The reason that it survives is that it's the exception that proves the rule. So the rule is that the vascular system is liable to be disrupted by a large amount of ice formation. And that leads to leakiness when you thaw back out, and that leads to tissue swelling. And most organs can't tolerate the tissue swelling. The tissue swelling then increases tissue pressure, and the tissue pressure presses back on the blood vessels and closes them off, and then you die of ischemia. But the intestine is a floppy organ. It can swell grossly and still perfuse itself, and that gives it time to heal, and so you can demonstrate survival. Most organs are not like that, but the ureter can, even if you freeze and thaw a kidney, the ureter will still survive and peristalse afterwards, which you might call that an organ if you want to. There have been some studies on freezing whole rat hind limbs and then transplanting them for a few days. And there's some evidence that that they may survive that process, although people I've spoken to are not really satisfied with the evidence, but they don't turn into large blood clots and turn black after a couple of days. They actually stay around for a few days until they get rejected. So there are some experiments like that. They're few and far between. There are claims in some cases that kidneys can be partly frozen and thawed and survive, but that's like 2 kidneys out of 200, or maybe 5 out of 10, but then or 3 out of 10, but then when somebody tries to duplicate the experiment, it doesn't work. So the overall evidence is not that great. Hearts have been able to be frozen to -20 since about 1954. And nobody's been able to get them to lower temperatures ever since. And that's hamster hearts, also works with rat hearts, but you can't take a heart down lower than that unless you're a frog. If you're a frog, then your heart can go down to dry ice temperature and back, but not by freezing. In the frog's case, you can do that by preventing ice formation all the way down to dry ice temperature by gradually perfusing the frog heart with ethylene glycol. If you perfuse in a little bit, that suppresses the toxicity of ethylene glycol. That allows you to cool the heart to a lower temperature without freezing it. At that lower temperature, you can add more ethylene glycol and so on and get yourself down to dry ice, and then you reverse the process and come back. And there are movies of these frog hearts beating normally after they're rewarmed. But you cannot do the same thing with a mouse heart, because the mouse heart doesn't tolerate enough ethylene glycol. It tolerates only about half of the amount that you need to preserve the heart without ice formation. You can preserve uteri in this method, however. Guinea pig uteri were cooled to dry ice temperature and warmed back up without ice formation by John Ferrant in 1965. And that's another triumph of cryobiology. You can also freeze pig uteri and other uteri and thaw them out and stimulate them with drugs and have them contract fairly normally. But those uteri have not been transplanted to challenge them. There have been experiments on freezing ovaries, on which the ovary can produce eggs after thawing and transplantation that can produce live young, but the ovaries are pretty beat up, so that's a very forgiving organ. It's not representative of what you would need for a heart or a kidney or a liver, the vital organs. So as far as the vital organs are concerned, the best result so far is a result we published in 2009, showing that it was possible to take a rabbit kidney down to -140 in all parts of the kidney, -130 in all parts of the kidney, warm it back up, transplant it, and have it support life. So why haven't we been doing that on a routine basis? Well, the reason is that although the kidney survived, there was some ice damage in that kidney, and we've been trying to refine our methods ever since. So where we are now is that we have made tremendous progress on reducing damage caused by cryoprotective agents. And one of the problems that we've had, though, is it's difficult to get the same result twice. So we might have a protocol that works great And then the next week we do the same protocol and it doesn't work great. And so right now I'm debugging that issue. I'm trying to take apart where this variability is coming from and correcting it. I think we're right on the brink of solving that problem. Once we solve that problem, we're in really interesting territory right now. We're able to load up the kidneys to levels of equilibration. In other words, if you perfuse in a cryoprotectant, it takes time for the concentration of the organ to match the concentration you're delivering. And you have to get more and more complete in your equilibration process nowadays to cryopreserve a kidney successfully. Because of nuances of the electromagnetic warming techniques that we're using, which I won't bore you with, but those techniques to prepare a kidney for electromagnetic warming so that you can warm it up without ice damage more easily, you actually have to expose it to ice formation conditions, let's say ice risk conditions, longer. So you can get more nucleation before you warm back up, which makes it harder to rewarm. So you have to have more cryoprotectant in it than even we thought before. So we're, in a way, we're chasing our tail, but we have been developing protocols recently to load up the kidneys with even more cryoprotective agent than usual without inducing more damage to the kidney. And right now we're at the threshold of being able to warm them up even without electromagnetic energy, just by simple conduction. They may be so stable that we can warm them up even without electromagnetic energy. This is sort of the equivalent of biological microwaving, right? For those who are not familiar with it. So either way, I think we're on the path to survival. And we have had some really interesting experiments recently in which we vitrify the kidney, we warm it up with radiofrequency energy, and we transplant it temporarily. And if you have ice damage, you see a couple of different things. One, the kidney looks lousy. Second, the kidney doesn't produce urine for 30 minutes after you transplant it. And third, when you take the kidney out after 30 minutes and wash the blood out, the blood doesn't wash out completely because the vascular system is shot. And so when you reperfuse it with blood, when you transplant the kidney, the blood extravasates. In other words, it leaks out of the blood vessels in the center of the kidney, which is the part that freezes the most easily. And then when you try to wash the blood out, you can't, because the blood is not in the blood vessels anymore, it's in the tissues. And we have not seen that in these recent experiments. The kidneys look beautiful. So they look pretty when we transplant them. They make urine for 30 minutes. The urine is not bloody. And when we flush them free of blood, they're free of blood. That blood is not trapped. So it's very, very exciting. We're right on the knife's edge with this at this point. We're not quite there. I have to go through this agonizing process of debugging this variability right now, but we know where the problem is. It seems to be related most likely to the washout step, and we think we know how to solve that problem. And so hopefully in another few weeks we'll nail this. So that's where we are right now. But we do have this proof of principle that even though the experiment was imperfect and we had ice damage, we had a kidney that supported life indefinitely after transplantation. That's the first vital organ that has survived cryopreservation. That meaning the first organ that you can't do without. If you don't have that organ, you will die, right? So you need your kidney, you need your heart, you need your liver, and this is the first one of those that survived in a clearly demonstrable and definitive way after cryopreservation. So we're on the right track with this. And I think that once we succeed, that will really change attitudes as to what's possible. But even now, thanks to the efforts of Sebastian Giwa and Lewis, his friend, Jed Lewis, and the Organ Preservation Alliance, and now these new centers that they're setting up, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for organ cryopreservation. It's not like it was for the last 40 years when I've been working in this field, which nobody cared and nobody thought it was even necessary or a good idea. Now everybody gets it. And I think that's very exciting. We can expect progress to accelerate. I think Rudi wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I love the fact that Greg is here to provide this level of nuance and scientific rigor and credibility. this is what you get from Greg, not from Rudi. But he's a rock star in a lot of people's books. Do you happen to know, Greg, if I heard that the Organ Preservation Alliance had managed to get a lot of commitments from Big Pharma and DARPA, and the 90 million figure sticks out someplace. I thought that was a DARPA related. Do you know what kind of funding is flowing toward research for Organ Preservation Alliance at this point in time?
Well, it's actually not to the Organ Preservation Alliance itself, I think, unless this is something else beyond what I'm familiar with. The Organ Preservation Alliance basically partnered with the University of Minnesota and several other institutions to basically create a consortium known as the ATP, which stands for something approximating Advanced Tissue Preservation.
Not to be confused with Answer to Prayer. It's a different group.
Oh, it's a different group? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Answer to Prayer. Yeah,
that's supposed to be funny, Greg.
For sure. Right, exactly. Yeah, so this is actually a National Science Foundation award that they got. The total will come up to something, if I remember correctly, like 50 or 60 million, something like that. But it comes in segments. And I think the first segment is, don't quote me, but it's on the order of 20 million or something like that. And then they have to jump through a series of hoops over time to justify getting the remaining installments. And eventually, I think it has to become self-supporting, and it has to go out into industry and show that it can actually affect people's lives, all of which is great, of course. So it's an alliance between UC Berkeley, University of Minnesota, Harvard University, and the University of California at Riverside. And then there are several companies that have roles to play around the periphery as well. So we will see. The good news is that all of that was put together and approved and funded, and that there's broad agreement that organ banking is likely possible. The bad news, you might say, is that a great deal of the money that has been raised for that effort will be spent on indirect things like social programs, educational programs, experiments on model systems like maybe zebrafish and things like that, cell preservation, some tissue preservation. I think the very small minority of the work will actually be spent on whole organ cryopreservation. And on that, I think that the group will be starting sort of behind where the field actually is at the cutting edge, because the cutting edge is in my lab and nobody else is in my lab right now. So, to just be immodest but true. So there's a lot of things that go into this that it takes years of experience to develop, and it requires specialized equipment and knowledge and techniques and so forth. So I will be helping them. I've helped them a tremendous amount already. We'll do so more as we go forward. But I think that the good news is that there will be efforts aimed at organs. In fact, I'm going to be participating in collaborative research with John Bischoff's lab, which is at the core of this whole thing, pretty soon. And we have some plans to cryopreserve rabbit kidneys using his nanoparticles, and then send them to him and warm them up there. But he may actually move his nano warming system to California so that we can warm up the kidneys and then transplant them. That would be exciting. And there may be some even more exciting things that we can do, which I'm not authorized to talk about, but would also capture a lot of attention. So this new effort at the University of Minnesota should help galvanize progress all the way around, and I think it's a very good thing.
Brilliant,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you, Greg. There is a follow-up question from David Wood that is quite relevant. He writes, Greg seems to be on the threshold of many important experimental breakthroughs. Could this progress go faster with a larger team of people, more R&D funding or partnerships? And I recall, you stated that right now you're the only person in your lab. Is this because of COVID-19, and how disruptive has that been to your efforts?
Well, what I'm actually trying to say is that we have about 25 people working in the lab, so it's not like I'm the only person in the lab, right? As a matter of fact, these days I don't even go to the lab. I do everything by telecommuting because I'm really old and I, could be subjected to COVID, right? Theoretically, so I'm sheltering myself, and we're doing everything possible to shelter everyone else in the lab. But they're much younger than I am, so they're at much less risk than I am. And we're also a very professional lab, and everybody understands science and medicine and disinfection and so forth. So I think we're in really excellent condition not to have the disease show up at our lab. But I personally am not there, but we have the expertise. And what I was trying to say is that the expertise is confined to my lab, not that I'm confined to my lab. What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
So do you think this progress could go faster with a larger team of people and more funding or partnerships?
Yeah, there's no question about it. So, for example, we have just enough people to do the research that we're doing right now. And sometimes people go on vacations and that disrupts our research, or people get sick and that can disrupt our research. We try to cross-train the people that we have to minimize those things, but sometimes we can't be avoided. If we had more personnel, we could do more. And then when we had events like that happen, we wouldn't have to stop doing experiments. We could keep them going. The biggest deficiency area right now is actually our brain project. So over time, that has been interrupted several times as people have left us for one reason or the other and not been replaced. I've been the executive director of the company for about a year, but before myself, the CEO of the company was not really interested in brain cryopreservation at all. And so, he made choices that made it impossible to do the work for a long period of time. But on a positive note, we expect to be acquiring a new staff member in January who is a neuropharmacologist. And we'll put an announcement on our website when it happens. I'm not doing it yet because it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. And he wants to do as much research on brain cryopreservation as possible. He's also going to be assisting our sister company with dog hypothermia experiments. And he'll also be assisting the cooperative research that we're doing with them, critical care research, on liquid ventilation experiments. But his primary job will be brain cryopreservation. And we really want to focus primarily in this coming year, now that we've done all the background studies on ultrastructure and we've qualified ourselves to do these experiments, we want to focus on brain viability. And we're going to look at this in many different ways. And hopefully we'll be able to start putting together direct evidence that brains can be cryopreserved, not only with the preservation of ultrastructure, but also with the preservation of some level of function. And we will see what we can see. But we have to start that process, and that's what we finally should be doing in the coming year. So I'm looking forward to that quite a bit.
If I might jump in here.
To finish up on that, but that doesn't mean that we have enough people, right? So if I had more people, which means more resources, we could do more experiments, and we could do more assays, and we could do more kinds of assays. So the more the merrier. So right now, our funding source has basically cut us to the bone. Our budget was reduced considerably for this year, and we're hoping to hold on to the current budget for next year, but we're at bare bones right now. So if there were any additional opportunities to get some support, that would be helpful.
So a related question to follow up is, how many other labs are there doing this type of research on vital organs? And then are there any other labs working on the brain?
Well, I think there's no other labs working on the brain in the way that we're talking about. Sebastian is setting up an institute that may eventually get there, but they're I think pretty far from that right now, although I could be wrong. I don't know I think they're focused primarily on brain tissue preservation.
Is that Sebastian Sung?
No, Sebastian Giwa or Jiwa.
Okay.
I actually still don't know exactly how it's pronounced, but I think it's Giwa. I've been mispronouncing it for years, but he never corrected me, so I'm still slightly ignorant.
I also call him Sebastian Erickson Giwa, so I think it's a hard G.
Yeah, I think it's probably a hard G. In any case, I think he wants to get there. I think he wants to get there, but he's going to be, by the nature of the process he's setting up, he's going to be looking at post-mortem human brains, which will be subjected to various periods of post-mortal deterioration, all kinds of uncontrolled issues like blood clotting or whatever. Whereas we're in a position to look at brains that are prepared when the animal is in good condition. So we can show what the full potential is. And if you want to look at viability, you have to do it that way. You're probably not going to do very well with a brain that's been dead for 6 or 12 hours, you know, in terms of viability. Although there was that experiment with pig brains in which they revived the, you know, some functions of the pig brain after, I think, 6 hours of death, but they never woke up, you know, so that's a partial success only. So I think that if you want to advance this field, you want to perfect brain cryopreservation. The way to perfect it is to show that you can do it on a viable brain. And so that's our goal. So to answer the question, no, nobody else is doing that. Nobody else in the world, to my knowledge, is doing whole organ cryopreservation research with the aim of transplanting those organs and showing that they're alive. There is some research on well, except for ovaries. Ovaries are being done sometimes in some places, and we're doing ovaries in our lab as well. I think our ovary program is advanced far beyond anyone else's, but there have been some sporadic attempts to preserve whole ovaries elsewhere. But very little work is being done. There's work that has been done on cryopreserving organs and then seeing how fast you can warm them with nanoparticles, nanowarming, or doing other non-definitive kinds of studies that don't prove viability. We're the only ones that bite the bullet and transplant these things. That's the only way you know absolutely for sure if the organ is alive or not. You transplant it. That's the acid test. Anything short of that is imperfect. You can take an organ and perfuse it with a bloodless solution and see if it functions or not, and that's great. But you don't know whether it would turn into one large blood clot when you transplant it. If you damage the endothelium and the platelets are activated when you transplant it, the organ could be perfectly happy otherwise, but if the vascular system is destroyed, the organ is not going to work. So are other people doing that? No.
Can I ask a question on that, Gennady? Because does any of the rest of you feel like that's just nuts? The commercial possibilities of that of cryopreservable organs must be in the billions of dollars, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of lives that we could save. Why in the world is it just because it's so darn hard? Is that why are not more labs working on this, Greg? Is that saying?
Well, I think I have an answer for you on that. I think the answer is credibility. So until 2013, nobody really thought this was going to work. And I've been pounding away at this forever because I felt it had to work. It didn't matter if it was improbable. It didn't matter if it was incredibly hard. It just has to be done, right? Because you can't get beyond that, if you don't get that far, right? And so in 2013, I was invited to give a symposium presentation at the 50th annual meeting of the Society for Cryobiology. It was a visible symposium because it was organized by Peter Maser, who discovered how to mathematically describe cell shrinkage and rewarm it, and reswelling during freezing and thawing. And it was Peter Maser who created the modern framework of conventional cryopreservation, by freezing. He figured out how it works and why it works, and he is a giant in the field. And he created this symposium about the role of water in cryopreservation, and he invited myself and Brian Woke to participate in that symposium. And we were in there with C. Austin Angel, who's the greatest scientist in the field of vitrification in general in the world, and another lady who I was less familiar with, who's also crackerjack in the field of the physics of vitrification. So Angel would study the vitrification of like lithium chloride or glass or whatever. not biological stuff, but he understands the biology because it's all the same physics, it's just different molecule. And so in that symposium, we started with water molecules, and we moved up with solutions, and then we moved to tissues, and then my talk was about organs. And I was able to lay out essentially proof at that time, a pathway by which we could cryopreserve organs. I was able to define what level of ice was acceptable and how to get there, and the fact that you could get there without killing the organ. And so we demonstrated that the feasibility of organ banking existed at that time, and it was a matter of putting all the pieces together to create one machine out of all of these working parts. And I think that changed people's minds. And I just noticed that after that, Sebastian came onto the scene. That's Sebastian G. Came onto the scene, and then people started taking things seriously. I think before that, the idea that you're going to spend your life doing something that couldn't be done, something that was incredibly costly, something that nobody would really give you any credit for, it just wasn't a tenable idea. So most of the research in the field has been done by surgeons back in the 60s and 70s, and to some extent the 80s, they were naive. They didn't understand the complexities of cryobiology. You could freeze sperm, wow. And you could freeze, red blood cells, wow. That means you can freeze kidneys. So they would use the same techniques that you would use for sperm on kidneys, and then they didn't understand why it didn't work. So they just kept trying it over and over and over and over again, and the kidneys kept dying and dying and dying and dying. And eventually, after decades, they just gave up, and not many people jumped into the breach after that. There were a few academic labs, including myself and David Peggs in the UK, and then John Farron, a few stragglers here and there who were studying it on an academic level, but not generally speaking with transplant experiments. And so it's too hard, it's too costly, there are too many unknowns. I've been working at this for decades. Nobody
something like 40 years, am I right?
Yeah,
You've been trying to get this done for 40 years.
Yeah,
that's a serious career. I mean, most people would not hang in for 40 years, Greg.
I'm determined. What can I say? I'm determined. I'm committed to making this work. And so, it's expensive, it's hard, and it takes a long, long time. And so and most people are funded by conventional grants, right? So you go to the grant source and say, give me money to freeze a kidney. They say, fine, here you go, freeze the kidney. You go to freeze the kidney, you go back and say, well, the kidney died, give me more money to freeze the kidney. Well, why should that? The kidney died, right? So you can say, well, we may learn this and that, but if there's no prospect of fairly early returns, the funding bodies are fairly risk averse. And at some point, an academic exercise of freezing whole kidneys doesn't look so attractive, and it's hard to keep that going. It's been an absolute miracle. One of the great miracles of existence is that I've been able to continue to do this research all this time. It's just, unbelievable. But other people haven't been able to do that. But it's necessary. It's indispensable. You can't get away from doing this because there are just an infinite number of variables. They all interact with each other. I presented a slide recently that shows, every single aspect of the protocol for adding and removing cryoprotectants matters. And the only way to find out what's the best thing to do is to alter every single step in that protocol, of which there are many, many, many elements. And so it takes this long, and people just have to be willing to invest. But now that it looks like it's close and feasible, now people get it, and they have enough encouragement, they're willing to move forward. So it's a different world. We're entering a different world.
On behalf of humanity, which is, I'm pretty sure we all speak for, at least the U.S. Transhumanist Party, we genuinely thank you for your amazing work. And the answer to my question, why aren't more people doing this? It's just so goddamn hard. It's just ridiculously hard to do. But I assume that you've got proprietary, when and if you can actually do it, you own the technology. It's proprietary tech.
That's true. Although our backers no longer are interested in having us protect the technology, so we'll see if we go on protecting it. But But we have patents that are in place, some of which are in process of getting granted. And certainly what we're doing now could shape up into a couple more patents if we want to. So yeah, we can protect it. And eventually, if we do that, we may be able to create a source of funding to expand research much more than what is happening right now. But we will see. We will see.
Well, speaking of being able to speak on behalf of humanity, I will point out the U.S. Transhumanist Party is the only political party in the United States, at the very least, with the term human in it. So there is some support for that assertion, Rudi.
Yeah, you do. When the aliens come, Gennady, you can be the rep.
So with regard to Greg's observation about the complexity of the field of cryobiology and how the early successes were made by people who essentially were dabbling in the field, but they were excited about the possibilities, and early successes kind of elevated their confidence for a while until they began to run into these more challenging obstacles with larger, more complex organs. But it seems to me that it's often the case in science that, at least in the early stages of a field's advancement, initial discoveries are made serendipitously by people who underestimate the magnitude of the task. And to some extent, that initial enthusiasm and that initial underestimation is valuable for achieving that progress.
Absolutely, because if you don't do anything, you learn nothing, right? So we learn from failures. We learn what doesn't work, and we also learn how much it doesn't work and in what way it doesn't work, and that narrows down the search field for things that may work. So I completely agree with you. All of the early work is incredibly valuable, even though it failed for the most part. The ironic thing about it is the things that succeeded are the things that were never repeated. Like cooling a guinea pig uterus to dry ice temperature, or cooling a frog heart to dry ice temperature. Nobody paid attention. I mean, it's two of the greatest achievements in cryobiology, and nobody ever followed up on it. And again, the reason for that is those experiments were not easy to do. They were a real pain to do, and most people just didn't want to devote the amount of effort to it and weren't motivated to do so. But we learn from all aspects of the field, both the successes and the failures. And in a way, what you just talked about applies to me as well, because I have told people many times, oh, we're almost there, and then find out that there's another barrier that I didn't know about, that now I have to solve this one too. And then another one, what, another one? But, I think we're out of barriers. I think we're out of barriers now. I think we have just one more to go. And part of that is because you have to keep defining the problem and redefining the problem. As you get closer and closer to solving the problem, there are fewer and fewer hidden variables for you to go through. And I think we're finally, hopefully, pretty much at the last one. So I'm still pretty optimistic, in spite of being wrong in the past about things, that we will be able to pull the rabbit out of the hat pretty soon.
Rabbit or rabbit kidney, perhaps.
Right.
But yes, indeed, I definitely share your hope for the sake of all of us who hope someday to benefit from these advances. And definitely a lot has been learned through these experiments, including the experiments that are unsuccessful. I think that speaks to some of the deficiencies in the way science is funded because of the risk aversion that you mentioned. A lot of funding bodies only want to invest in or support projects that they think are highly likely to succeed, but they don't necessarily appreciate the learning that happens from the experiments that don't succeed.
Yes, I think part of the issue is that in theory, it's possible to sustain an organ banking program over decades of failure, provided that you pitch the program at a very academic level, so that no matter what happens, you're going to learn something scientifically from it that will contribute to the long-term goal. Another problem with this field has been that a surgeon or even a biochemist is not a cryobiologist. They don't know how to think about the problem at that level of detail, at that level of depth. you can pose some very interesting biochemical problems, but they may be irrelevant because the physical way that you propose to do the experiment is nonsensical. And so no matter, what your level of expertise is in biochemistry, it's irrelevant because you're doing something stupid, like freezing the organ or something, and no degree of biochemistry will save you from that. So having the right skill set is very important here too. To do cryobiology, you have to be a cryobiologist. You have to think through cryobiological problems, and most people are not trained as cryobiologists. There are no departments of cryobiology. There are no schools of cryobiology. Cryobiology is a sideline, right? You do it in your spare time, and it's hard to bank organs in your spare time. So, it's been a long road to get to where we are now, but at least finally we're straightening things out.
Yes, indeed.
Gennady, could I just add something very important, I think, because I love these important scientific, rigorous technical details. I love the fact that we're not talking past the science. We're dealing with the fact that there are some serious obstacles that exist. We're not pretending they don't. But at the same time, I want to make sure that your brain does not go to those completely before you start the process of signing up for cryonics. These are kind of two separate issues. Just because Greg's been sitting on his ass for 40 years and didn't have this thing fixed, that does not mean that you should be waiting to sign up for cryonics. The thought leaders like Aubrey de Grey, who clearly understand, one, that anti-aging eventually will probably happen. The thought leaders like Bill Falloon, who understand that age reversal is at some point imminent or will be. They still understand that you need to, that won't help you if you get sick now. So getting the technical details that Greg has provided aside, the legitimacy of signing up for cryonics now, the rationality of that still applies. And I want to make sure that that goes into the brain, the heart center, and the emotional center of your brain at this moment, which is, yeah, the science is still in process. That does not mean that signing up for cryonics is not one of the smartest things you can do right now.
And I think that goes to a key difference that I had with Ken Hayworth during our September 27th virtual Enlightenment Salon, where Ken Hayworth stated essentially, before we do anything on humans, the technology and the approach has to be completely scientifically vetted, accepted, through peer review, through established institutions, whereas some people don't have the time to wait for that, essentially. But Ken Hayworth...
That approach will simply kill thousands or millions of people. I'm sorry, Ken, but that is a wrong-headed approach, and I'll go on the record as saying that is a completely wrong-headed approach in this particular field. Thank you.
So he does have a question for Greg, and I think...
Can I comment on the last two comments before we move on?
Certainly.
So part of the issue here is, I appreciate what both of you have just said, but scientists in general and cryobiologists in particular, they want something more concrete than that, right? So they want some kind of evidence, right? And so the scientific point of view here is show me the money, right? And that's why I think this kind of data collection that we're discussing today is so critical. I think up to now, the scientists have not had enough information to judge whether the proposals that you're just talking about are rational or just emotional outbursts. I think we know the answer now, right? So the results that I've described to you say, that there's at least, if nothing else, ultrastructural preservation of the brain, right? And that's a lot better than nothing. And even ultrastructural preservation of the brain in an actual case that was done on a human being, right? So we know that answer now, but it's not published, right? So when that comes out, then I think that the debate over these issues will be much more enlightened than it has been up to this point.
Yes, let us hope so. And Ken Hayworth does have another question for you. He asks, Greg, Could you
Sure.
say something about how likely it is to get a good cryonics brain preservation under laboratory conditions versus under real life conditions? And Robert McIntyre had a clarifying comment to that question. He stated, when I look at brains after a few hours of ischemia, then straight fixation, / imaging, they look really bad. During a typical cryonics case, there's often a few hours of ischemic time. So he's speaking to the difference between ideal lab conditions where you might be able to preserve that brain right away versus real life conditions where you might not be able to get to it for a few hours after, say, a traumatic event.
Yeah, these are really critical points. They're very well taken. But we can say a few things about them, right? So the human case that I discussed was actually processed in the normal way. He received treatment that was better than many, but not better than all, I would say. He got cryoprotected about 3 hours after his heart stopped beating, and his brain was so saturated with cryoprotectants, we were not able to freeze the biopsy samples no matter what we did to them. And the ultrastructure was preserved, and there was no ice cavities in the brain, and everything looked normal histologically as well, just a little bit shrunken, of course. So it can happen. The question is, how often does it happen? And the answer is definitely not often enough, right? So in the real world, we have a huge gap between what could be and what is. And I think that what we need to close that gap is more data, more evidence, more science, because as long as this idea is not taken seriously, then you're not going to get the institutional support that you need to generally do these sorts of procedures under good conditions. And if you don't, you're fighting an uphill battle. And we've done some experiments at our lab in which we have killed pigs, let them sit around for an hour at room temperature. Well, actually, the pig is at much higher temperature than room temperature. And then preserve them for 24 hours by cold perfusion, and then loaded their brains up with M22 and looked at their ultrastructure. And in at least one case, the ultrastructure looked really good. We just didn't do, at the time that I analyzed that, I didn't have a lot of other results. And I still haven't gone back retrospectively to catch up with that. But it can be done, right? But that's an hour of warm ischemia. That's not 10 hours of warm ischemia. That's an hour of warm ischemia followed by immediate cooling with state-of-the-art techniques, not by some, jury-rigged kind of thumper, kind of inefficient cooling system that you're doing out in a garage or, a vehicle or a parking lot someplace, So there's a lot of imperfections with this kind of procedure, the way it's being done today. And nobody should really have any illusions about that. I think most people who are interested in this realize that there's a problem there. And like the old saying goes, you pays your money and you takes your chances. But we want the chances to get better and better and better. The way to do that is to show that there's a reason to consider this kind of procedure. And you do that through science. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yes, indeed. And I definitely agree. More examples of successful organ cryopreservations, and indeed, hopefully someday successful animal cryopreservations will raise the credibility of the field, and with regard to what Rudi's trying to advocate for, will interest more people in cryonics. Now, another question from Luke Parrish pertains to the brain cryopreservation as compared to the preservation of other organs. So he asks, is there anything about the brain that makes it easier to cryopreserve without damage versus other organs? Would it make sense to devote large amounts of funding directly to brain preservation research?
Right, so there's a couple components to that. One has to do with the importance of brain cryopreservation research, which is a subject that people have differing viewpoints about. And then the second, the first part of the question actually is there anything about brain cryopreservation that makes it easier? there's actually a couple things. One is ironic, the other is not. The ironic part of brain cryopreservation that might make it easier is this contraction, the shrinkage process that we're currently seeing with most brain cryoprotection protocols, because the shrinkage concentrates intracellular proteins, and the concentration of intracellular proteins increases the stability of the cells against ice formation. So to a certain extent, this problem is an advantage in that shrinking the brain tends to improve its vitrification tendency. And we've been able to take brains and cool them with only 80% M22 and warm them back up and not see any ice holes in them. 80% M22 tends to freeze, so that the brain may actually be more stable than the M22 itself, although that's very off the cuff kind of observation. So don't take it too seriously, but we did that enough that I think it's true. The other thing that's not ironic is that from what we've been able to see, and I guess it's not completely definitive, but what we've been able to see is that the brain it's not subject to chilling injury. And chilling injury is a huge problem for kidney cryopreservation. It's one that we still will have to face ultimately. We know we can overcome it because we had that one survivor that we did in the old days. But we're going to have to maybe spend some time working on minimizing that once we start demonstrating routine survivals. We may have to improve the quality of survival over time. We won't have that problem with the brain. Liver also is terribly susceptible to chilling injury. Hearts have a different problem. They're like the brain, but they tend to shrink like the brain does, but they don't have a blood-brain barrier. So cracking that is something that may be harder than hearts because you can't use SDS to permeabilize heart cells because you'll kill them. So maybe the brain does have advantages in certain respects. And I think that the amount of resources that goes into preserving them depends on what you think they're good for. Some people think that brains are not very important because you can't do anything with them. You can't transplant them. You know, you just take a few biopsies if you like a neuron to grow in culture or to, you know, transplant to cure Parkinson's disease or something like that. But why bother with this whole thing unless you're a neurobiologist and you want to map out the connectome of the entire brain? Then you need the whole brain. So people's opinions differ, and also people with a medical point of view about brain banking, of course, are a whole different category. So those people so far, by and large, have not really, well, with some exceptions, have not lavished a lot of money on brain banking. So so you're asking a question about a value judgment. It depends on what your values are.
Yes, thank you for your answer, Greg. And I think this also speaks to a broader question, which is, why are some organisms so much easier to cryopreserve than others? I'm reminded of the study that Natasha Vida-Moore participated in 2014, and I recall her presenting the preliminary results of that study in early 2014 at the Transhuman Visions conference in Piedmont, California, I believe. And she showed images of the C. elegans worm that had been cryopreserved and then revived, and it seemed to show signs of remembering certain behaviors and certain stimuli that it had been subjected to previously. And yet, we've had occasional instances of successfully thawing a rabbit kidney, but not a whole rabbit, not a whole bird, not a whole primate. So what is it about the C. elegans worm that sometimes makes us want to be a sentient version of one of those?
It's simplicity. In a nutshell, it's the simplicity. As Scotty once said in a Star Trek movie, the more complicated the plumbing, the easier it is to stop it up. You know, so if you have a body plan that includes only 939 cells or whatever it is, there's not a lot that can go wrong compared to something like a human who has more like 10 trillion cells. That's one answer. Another answer is that you don't have to perfuse the C. elegans. You can dunk it in glycerol and let it take up the cryoprotectant that way. So you don't have to worry about the details of how you add and remove the cryoprotectant. You don't have to worry about perfusing the vascular system, for example.
If I might jump in here though, what about these frogs though? Because frogs seem fairly complicated.
Right. So let's talk about that. So the frogs introduced the next part of the answer to your question, actually. So the other tremendous advantage of C. elegans is that they're small. So heat mass transfer can take place pretty quickly. You can cool them and warm them very fast. You can add and remove cryoprotectants fairly quickly. With big tissue masses, it takes longer to do these things, and the longer it takes, the more liable you are to various time-dependent detrimental processes. So let's go to the frog. So what does the frog do? The frog is famous for surviving freezing, but in a way, it actually doesn't survive freezing. Actually, the frog is a good example of why we want to vitrify things, because what the frog does is very sneaky. First of all, it can hold its breath for 2 weeks, which is a handy trick that we don't really have as mammals. So it's got a lot of time to play with, right? It's completely anoxic during its frozen state, and it doesn't care because it's an invertebrate. I mean, it's a poikilotherm. It's cold-blooded, certainly a vertebrate. But what it has a lot of tricks. One of the tricks that it has is it also takes advantage of its small size. It's much bigger than C. elegans, but it's much smaller than we do. And it can do this following trick, which is a very nifty idea that we cannot do. It forms ice in the abdominal cavity by nucleating it there deliberately. And because in nature, the temperature drops fairly slowly, and they're under leaves to make the temperature change even slower, ice formation in the abdomen will raise the temperature of the frog for a while. It goes back up to its freezing point, close to 0 degrees Celsius. And heat transfer is very slow. And so what happens is that you essentially lower, without getting too technical, you lower the vapor pressure of water in the abdomen, and water has to go where its vapor pressure is low. So you can imagine a glass that you had on the oven. It's got a high vapor pressure. The water comes out of the glass and goes into the room where vapor pressure is lower. So in the frog, the vapor pressure is high in the organs and low in the abdomen. So it goes out of the organs and into the abdomen. That means the organs physically shrink and ice grows in the abdomen some distance away from the organs. And so actually the frog succeeds by freeze avoidance in a sense. Yes, there's ice in there, but there's not a lot of ice in the vital organs. And when ice does invade the vital organs, the frog starts to get into trouble. And in fact, exactly the same thing happens in mammals. If you take a hamster, you can freeze the same amount of water in a hamster as you can in a frog. The only difference is you can't hang out for 2 weeks. You can only hang out for about an hour, but you can freeze out the same amount of ice, and you do it in a similar way. The organs dehydrate, and they don't have a lot of ice forming in the organs themselves. And when ice begins to invade the organs and you thaw those hamsters out, you see ruptured blood vessels and less and less quality of survival. By the way, as an aside, in those experiments, since we were talking about brain preservation earlier, they found in those experiments that you could freeze out about 63% of the water in the brain and still have the animals behave normally after they were thawed out. So that's pretty cool. But there are problems with it. There's problems with taking advantage of that, but that was an interesting observation. So yeah, so there are organisms that are even more amazing than the frog is the leech. So there's certain leeches that you can freeze in liquid nitrogen temperature and thaw them out, and they survive that. And I don't think anyone quite knows how that works.
I have another quick question I'm very curious about, which is, has anyone looked at using specific proteins that are, have evolved in nature for cryoprotection in, say, insects? It would be kind of like the way we find drugs in natural products. Has anyone looked at, taking some of these cryoprotectant molecules that are used by insects or proteins, special, I think they're special proteins, right?
Right. So
antifreeze proteins.
Exactly. So you find antifreeze proteins not only in insects, but also in fish and a variety of other animals as well. And what they do is they physically attach to ice crystals to prevent them from growing. So the ice is below its freezing point, and it's ice. So the solution is not really supercooled, but the water adjacent to the ice remains supercooled rather than being converted into ice, which people would have thought was physically impossible before Art de Vries came by and showed that giant fish in the ice caps, they eat ice, they brush against ice with their cut wounds and everything, and they survive, even though their freezing point is high enough that if you inoculate them with ice, they ought to freeze. So he found out that the reason they can escape is that ice crystals are essentially immobilized in cages of these antifreeze proteins. And you're right to point out the beetles because they're the champions at this. You can get 10 degrees of what you call thermal hysteresis out of these beetles. You can have ice present and not grow until you go 10 degrees below the freezing point, the thermodynamic freezing point, which is pretty useful in nature. And some of these beetles may actually vitrify in nature as a result of that. They have bodies that contain a lot of glycerol and a lot of these antifreeze proteins, and they may actually be able to freezing point depress themselves down to below ambient temperatures. So the problem with conveying those to like real large-scale organ preservation is cost, mostly cost. There are other problems potentially as well.
Would you think like genetic engineering could help? Like if you could say have like a bacteria or algae grow these and produce these proteins in big vats. Do you think that would work?
Well, sure. Yeah, that would help a lot. That would help a lot.
I just feel like there's a lot of potential.
There are people that have tried to do that in various ways, including people that have manufactured salmon that mass produce antifreeze proteins.
I think there's been
proteins and then eat the salmon.
GMO apples or something like that that are more well, they don't brown, and I think there may be some work on GMO foods that would last longer at cold temperatures. I'm not really sure though.
Well,
but that would be an application area, I suppose.
People have used anti-proteins in ice cream already, and that seems to be helpful. And there are prospects for designing antifreeze protein-like molecules that are small molecules, thereby a lot more accessible, a lot cheaper, and don't introduce other issues like antigen formation, which might promote some kind of immune response when the organ is transplanted. But I think the main obstacle has been cost. There just has not been anybody who's produced antifreeze proteins in sufficiently large quantities and low costs to enable them to be included in multi-liter volumes of cryoprotectant solutions that you need to protect an organ. So if somebody changes that, we'll have a look. But there's another problem.
To that, Greg, Gennady, Mr. Chair, may I ask a question? Which has to do with the cryoprotective toxicity, which has been a major challenge. We know that I guess it will lyse the cells if it's too strong. What progress is being made on cryoprotectant toxicity?
Yeah, I can't think of a single example in which any cryoprotectant has ever lysed any cell. So I think that's a myth that's been promulgated by people who like to use hyperbaric xenon in place of regular cryoprotective agents. There seems to be a lot of desire to do that sort of thing on the part of Russians for some reason. I think it's because it's a simpler thing to try to do than actually deal with cryoprotectant toxicity up front. But having said that, cryoprotectants are certainly toxic, and that's a big problem. We have some ideas for approaching that, which we will be pursuing in detail. We think we can get to the finish line initially without any special tricks beyond what we've already elaborated. But we do have ideas in mind. So I think that one pathway to cryoprotectant toxicity is through water. So what I mean by that is that we live our normal lives with our proteins surrounded by a lot of water. And proteins function because they're folded up in a certain shape. And that shape is dependent upon the water content of the medium around them. And we're asking those proteins to hang on to their normal shape without all that water around them, and that's a tall order. But we do have proteins in our bodies that stabilize other proteins. So they're called heat shock proteins, and proteins unfold not just because they're exposed to cryoprotectants, which doesn't really happen in nature that much, but they unfold also if you get too hot. And so nature has elaborated proteins that stabilize other proteins. They're called chaperonins or heat shock proteins. And there's evidence that perhaps increasing heat shock proteins might reduce cryoprotectant toxicity. So it's a little bit tricky to apply that, but that's one thing that we hope to pursue in the future. But I think we can make it with conventional cryoprotectants. I don't, and maybe there's a possibility of discovering a new cryoprotectant nobody's ever heard of before. We actually discovered one of them. We haven't told anybody about it yet because it's not all that great, but it did allow us to solve a problem for a biotechnology company that we work with in the past. But there's not a lot of scope for discovering a lot of new cryoprotectants for all kinds of reasons that I won't bore you with, but it is an issue. The ironic thing that we discovered in about the last 4 years, at least with M22, is that it's not that the toxic effect of the cryoprotectants are not actually concentration dependent. Once you get above a certain concentration, what happens is that for reasons we don't understand, once you get above once you are below a certain concentration, there's no problem. The cryoprotectants are extremely non-toxic. And these are really high concentrations, and they're still essentially non-toxic. I can perfuse them for a really long time, and there's no problem to speak of. But once you go above some threshold, which we haven't totally defined exactly where it is yet, it's not that the cryoprotectant becomes more toxic, it's that it triggers a time-dependent process of some sort that ticks at the same rate regardless of what the concentration is. It seems to tick at the same rate regardless of what the temperature is. So, even as we cool below -22, that clock seems to tick at the same rate, maybe even all the way down to -80. And that's really the ultimate problem that we need to solve. We know we can solve it for rabbit kidneys because we transplanted a rabbit kidney and had it survive. But this is one of those issues. So we think that may be either chilling injury or something else that hasn't been discovered before. And we'll have to deal with that, and it's a mystery. But the good news is that biology is biology. It's not physics, which means that if you break it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the game, because the biological system can repair itself. So we transplant kidneys every day, and for a while, for a few days, they don't function very well, and then they repair themselves, and they're just as good as new at the end of the day. So we can afford to have injury like that as long as it's reversible. And we found that even very severe looking injury in the short run can be completely reversed based on serum chemistry results that you get after you allow the organ enough time to heal. So yeah, it's an ongoing issue. It's hard to deal with because cryoprotectants are exposed to every single molecule in the cell. So how do you piece out which molecule is the key one? We actually published a paper last year, which actually got an award that charts a potential way of doing that. So we collaborated with the University of Colorado, and we created a library of embryonic stem cells that had 30,000 independent different mutations. And then we challenged those with M22 to see which mutations resisted M22 the best. And we found that those same mutations also resist DMSO. And if you freeze them to dry ice temperature, they survive much better than control embryonic stem cells. So the beauty of this experiment is you can identify specific genes that are critical for cryoprotectant toxicity, and then come up with drugs that mimic the effect of those mutations. And then you've got something really revolutionary. But we're still at the early stage with that project. That's another way to deal with toxicity.
Very interesting. Now, I would be interested in hearing you compare and contrast the common cryoprotectants used today with glutaraldehyde, because in the virtual Enlightenment Salon with Ken Hayworth, Dr. Hayworth essentially said any organism that is preserved with glutaraldehyde is completely dead. All bodily processes have stopped, and it's an irreversible kind of preservation. Also, glutaraldehyde is highly toxic. So contrast that with the common cryoprotectants used today, or the cryoprotectants that you think show the most promise, particularly in regard to reversibility as well as the effect on the various organs or processes within those organs.
All right, I'll take a stab at this. So glutaraldehyde is a cross-linking agent. It's like a pair of handcuffs, and one pair of, one half of the handcuff will clip onto one protein and the other side clips onto another protein. Now, instead of having two separate proteins, you have a glob of two proteins that are bonded together. But there's nothing to stop those two proteins from being bonded to other proteins in their vicinity as well. So, the way you define a molecule is a discrete set of atoms that's separated from all other atoms. So when you perfuse glutaraldehyde through a brain, for example, you almost make the entire brain into one molecule in a sense. All the molecules become indistinct from each other to a certain, way of speaking. And life cannot exist under those conditions, and that's what is being referred to. And I know Robert loves to say that, that it's completely dead, and he's completely right. So on the other side of the coin is regular cryoprotective agents. So what they do is they just go in and they replace water. They don't really have direct effects on proteins. The evidence that we have is that they may affect proteins indirectly by affecting water structure and water availability, but that doesn't change the identity of the proteins. The protein is still the same as it was before. It still has the same identity. And even if it denatures, much of the time, this denaturing or unfolding process is spontaneously reversible. And in cases where it isn't, maybe it's reversible with the help of the chaperones. And even when it's not reversible, even then, there was a report out of the University of California at Irvine several years ago about how to uncook an egg, because when you cook an egg and it turns into a solid, that's protein denaturation. And they were able to reverse that process. So protein denaturation is not very scary compared to aldehyde fixation, at least on a chemical level and on a physical level for that matter too. The other concern that you have is that if you're doing fixation, what else are you changing besides the proteins? You're not necessarily fixing all the lipids, so you may lose lipids over time, and people have seen things like that. If you take material that's been fixed for long periods of time and you store it, on the shelf, you see things like pools of lipids sort of accumulating on the surface of the sample over time. It takes time, but that does tend to happen. So fixation is not a complete process. So what we did with Robert in the ASK experiments is we combined fixation with cryopreservation, which eliminates that drawback of fixation being incomplete. But even then, you have other issues, like in the case of the brain, for example, does fixation release neurotransmitters? By permeabilizing cell membranes. There's a lot there that needs to be understood better to understand the full impact. Whereas, Isamu Suda cryoprotected cat brains back in the 1960s, froze them to -20 for 5 days, thawed them out, and then reperfused them with cat blood in this artificial machine and got electroencephalograms, which are very similar to the same brain before it had been cryopreserved, which obviously requires electrical signaling, which obviously requires neurotransmitter function, right? So at least it seems that, and his brains were shrunken too. 15% glycerol is enough to shrink the brain almost as much as full strength M22. And yet the synapses were certainly functioning in that experiment. So it's not a given that cryoprotectants release neurotransmitters. Now, actually, there's a really interesting experiment that was done many years ago by a neurochemist who wanted to study synaptic transmission in the brain. And there's this preparation of the brain called synaptosomes. So you basically take the brain and put it into a blender, and what you get out is the synapses are separated from the rest of the brain. The two neuronal processes on each side close off. You know, they're destroyed, but the membranes close off to form closed loops. So you have a functional system, and you can study neurotransmitter release and things like that. And they found that that the synaptosomes work perfectly well in most cases, even if you freeze the brain tissue before you isolate them with no cryoprotectant at all. There's one exception, glutamate receptors were lost, but I mean, give me a break, that's no cryoprotectants at all. So I think that the likelihood is that cryoprotectant introduction will have less of a disturbing effect on normal physiology than aldehyde fixation. In fact, that's virtually a guarantee, since there is no physiology left with aldehyde fixation. So in terms of you know, how you want to preserve a brain, I want to preserve a brain with conventional cryoprotectants if at all possible, because then I have a much better chance of demonstrating things like viability or brain functions that might be useful in all kinds of applications, including you know, medical applications such as taking brain regions and transplanting them to correct Alzheimer's disease or correct Parkinson's disease and things like that. You're never going to get that with an Alzheimer's with an aldehyde fixed brain. And we think it's possible. It's harder, but we do what's necessary, not what's easy. You know, we go for the best thing. We don't try to make it easier on ourselves, right?
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that answer, Greg. And there's another question from David Wood, who would like to hear more about leeches surviving negative 196 degrees.
Yeah, I've looked at that paper. I can't say that I've committed it to memory, but if memory serves, you don't have to do any special techniques with these leeches. You just freeze them to liquid nitrogen temperature using a pretty sloppy technique and thaw them out. They're basically fine, and I don't think anyone really knows how they do it. A lot of organisms that survive freezing in nature can also survive drying, and they elaborate trehalose. And trehalose goes into the cell membrane and prevents it from responding to dehydration. So if a cell is frozen or if a cell is dried to a certain point, the membrane tends to reorganize itself. And the trehalose prevents that from happening and prevents the membranes from getting leaky. But I don't know that the leeches really do that. I think they may have some other trick up their sleeve. So I wish I knew more. I wish people in general knew more about how the leeches do it, but I'm afraid I can't shed a lot of light on that right now. But I think that paper is open access. So if you look at leeches and liquid nitrogen, you'll probably find the paper and you can read all the details for yourself.
Thank you, Greg. And if we find it, we will post a link to it in the chat. Now, I'd like to...
I actually have a copy of the paper. I can send it to you if you'd like it.
Yes, please do. And then we can update the video description after the Salon recording is available with that link. So now let's see if some of our other officers have questions for Greg, either Charlie or Art Ramon or Pavel.
I have a question. Any experiments with cryonic preservation and reanimation of fetuses, like mammalian fetuses in different stages of development?
I don't know of any experiments like that that have ever been done. So there's a couple problems. So you can certainly preserve embryos, and human embryos have been preserved, and embryos of virtually every species you can think of. Certainly domesticated species have been preserved, but fetuses is a different story. So you can preserve embryos because embryos are basically cell clusters, and cell clusters can be cryoprotected just by diffusion. You dunk the cells into the cryoprotectant, they take it up, and you're ready to go. But once you get up to the fetal stage, then you have a heart that has to beat. So in other words, the thing is bigger than, so when you're an embryo, you can take all the oxygen that you need up just by diffusion straight through your skin, essentially. But when you get big enough, that doesn't work anymore. The diffusion distances become too great. So you need to have a circulatory system, which means you need to have a heart. And when you get to that stage, you can't deliver cryoprotectants effectively unless you perfuse. So you would have to remove the fetus, keep it alive in vitro somehow, perfuse it with cryoprotectant, freeze and thaw it or vitrify it or whatever you want to do, remove all of that stuff, and then put it back into the uterus to let it go on to development. And I think that there's a point in fetal development in which you cannot even take it out and put it back in and still have it survive. And that would be in the earlier stages. Obviously, there are babies that are born prematurely and they're practically fetuses at the time, or maybe formally they are still fetuses. I don't know, but they can go back in the uterus and develop. But there's a gray zone between that level and earlier levels at which I don't think it works. So there's a lot of technical problems with doing those experiments. And so I think that's the main reason that they haven't been done. And I guess the other reason would be nobody would probably be motivated to try those experiments. But it's glib to say that humans have already been cryopreserved successfully because they've been cryopreserved as embryos, but an embryo is a very different animal even than a fetus or a more advanced developmental stage.
I could add to my slide that on that, because I do talk about embryos. P.S. This is glib, but maybe that's obvious. Oh, by the way, to your question,
I think I get it.
Can you imagine how the religious right would object to would feel about us pulling out embryos and trying to freeze them? They'd have a fit.
I think a lot of people would probably have a fit. But the biggest problem is that
we have enough controversy without trying for additional controversy, folks.
That's true, and you have to understand that an experiment like that would fail the first time it was tried, and it would probably fail the first 100 times it was tried. So doing human experiments like that would really not be in the cards. I think you'd want to try that in an animal.
What confines informed consent? Informed consent for a fetus, I think, would be hard to determine.
That's a hard one to crack.
They can't grasp the pen.
Yeah, exactly. Or the concept.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Hey, Charlie.
Yeah. Hey, Greg, how are you, man? Good to see you.
Great to see you. Good luck with your candidacy.
Thank you.
You got a great running mate.
Yeah, the only way I'll win is if everybody just pays attention to Liz.
That'll almost do it right there.
I know. It's great to see you. I love the work you do as usual. And on a note to what Rudi mentioned there about the religious right, if you look at the current state of who were nominated or who's being nominated for the court, for the Supreme Court, according to them, humans begin at conception. So in reality, we've apparently already cryopreserved humans. You can call them fertilized eggs, but nope, they're humans. They have rights, and we've done it. So congratulations. What I was going to say is, with regard to what you're doing, obviously the most important thing for me or any cryonicist, I would think, is the preservation of the brain, not the kidney and all that. It's interesting stuff, but I think one of the problems that you might be facing, or your organization, with regard to funding, is the fact that there are so many companies that are now growing organs. I mean, Martine Rothblatt owns Revivicor, and they're growing human organs in pigs. So, and then there's a lot of other companies that have already grown brand new organs. So the idea of having to cryopreserve, I guess, a donated organ, it seems like a moot point when you can get brand new ones. And with personalized medicine, it can be such that you can just have brand new bodies essentially grown for you, with the main thing being your brain being preserved. So I think that could be an issue. I know that I've tried to get funding help for Sebastian Giwa. I've actually, talked to him and Aubrey, and we've tried to get to people to get money for that. But again, like I said, one of the barriers is that a lot of companies are growing organs. And when you have brand new organs, it almost defeats the purpose of trying to preserve, a donated organ, if you see what I'm saying. However, brain preservation is crucial. And so your work in that is very important. And I'm glad that you were able to come on today and compare what you're doing with your preservation technique as opposed to the aldehyde fixation that we heard 2 weeks ago, because I think it straightened out the idea of why what you're doing has more viability. So thanks. And
You're
good.
welcome. Yeah, so let me comment. That's a lot of great comments, Charlie. Thanks for bringing them up. So I actually don't think that the organ manufacturing business is going to put organ cryopreservation out of business, because you have to do something with those organs. You have to develop a little bit of perspective here. Number one, none of those organs have ever been transplanted and shown to support life so far, right? We're not there yet, right? But we are in transplant medicine right now. We have organs that are available that are not being used because they can't be preserved long enough, or if they are used, they get rejected because they can't be preserved long enough. Now, one of the plans that I have for implementing banking into clinical transplantation is that you take somebody who has a D match, which is the worst possible tissue match, and you hold that organ back for a period of time until that organ, which would have had an accelerated rate of rejection, can find a recipient that's an A match for that particular organ, and you give that person that organ. But in the meantime, people are growing these organs, and that's great. But there are other ways of generating organs besides growing them in a laboratory, and that's growing them in animals. So Martine has been involved not only in growing animals in the lab, but growing animals, organs in a lab, but growing organs in pigs, right?
Yeah, revivicor. That's what I was saying.
Right. So other people are doing like organ printing and, organ repopulation with cells after stripping away all the cells from a dead organ and using the scaffolding, the extracellular matrix as a scaffold. There's a lot of different approaches. Nothing has worked so far. The thing that will probably work the first, in my opinion, because it's the easiest, is this technique of humanizing animals, humanizing pigs in particular. I think that shows a great deal of promise. But do you want to have a pig farm located in every metropolitan area? You probably don't, right? So you're going to have one or two of these centers someplace growing the pigs, and you're going to want to ship those organs to the centers where they're needed. But that requires scheduling, right? And so there's always a logistics issue. Maybe you can make an organ on one place, and maybe you need an organ at another place, but you make it and need it at exactly the same time every time, especially if you're going to be transplanting 800,000 organs every year. And the answer is no. I mean, I think it's pretty clear the answer is no. You can try that, and you can succeed to a certain level, but you're going to want to have some kind of insurance policy. So if you have a stockpile of organs in a bank, let's say you're growing pig organs, and you can make those pig organs whatever tissue type you want to match a variety of recipients, or have them be universal donors for that matter. You can produce the organs any old way you want, on any schedule that you want, put them in a bank, locate them anywhere you want, and then the person can order them, like ordering something from a catalog, like the old Sears Roebuck catalog. Give me a kidney today, or give me a liver today, right? And then you can plan the schedule of the surgery whenever you want. And if the patient gets a cold the day before surgery and it has to be called off, you don't have to throw that organ away. You just leave it in the bank a little bit longer. And so there's a lot of advantages to that that I don't think you would otherwise be able to gain. So I don't think you'll put it out of business. You'll reduce the need, but I still think there'll be an ample need for organ banking. Even if you can have an ample number of organs, what you'll want then is supply chain management, right? And organ banking is the key to that.
Well, I think it's I agree. Organ banking is good, and I like to see. For me personally, I think all things should be done. We should be moving forward with everything and have all options available. I think that's always the most important thing to look at anything. I just think that but I'd like to see the brain. I'd like to see as much money and funding to preserve the brain more than anything, because that's the one.
Another
order from a pig.
Another thing that just occurred to me is, for people who aren't going to be doing whole body cryonics, which is the vast majority of people, they can donate their organs. And right now we can't. We're having a huge issue where we can't. We're having trouble matching them and such. But in the future, it may be more economical just to take organs from organ donors and bank them,
I think the only
as opposed to growing them from scratch.
Yeah. I mean, I think this takes us back to earlier discussions, which is that, you know, from a scientific point of view and from a medical point of view, nothing like that is going to happen until we have an evidentiary basis for brain preservation that is convincing enough to enable that procedure to be done in the same hospital that's collecting organs for transplant, right? We're not close to that.
I think that was really the core of Ken Hayward's point. Was I think he would agree that people should have this option of even to do unproven to undergo unproven techniques, but the scientific community should be focused on demonstrating it, and in the long term we need to do that. We need to be focused on that in order to get it into hospitals and have it as a part of the standard of care.
Right. So as a scientist, I just need to make a statement, you know, just to make sure everything is clear, and that when people are watching this on YouTube, they don't, you know, misinterpret things. So I'm here as a scientist. I'm here as a cryobiologist. I'm not here to advocate cryonics. I'm not here to defend cryonics. I'm here to gain information that bears on the issue. And I'm also, you know, politically, I'm a libertarian. And I think that people are free to make any choices that they want. And the Society for Cryobiology thinks that people are free to make any choices that they want. So that's about all that I can say about cryonics, is that what it needs and what science needs in general is more data, right? So I'm trying to help the discussion. That's my role here and in life. You know, I'm just trying to help the discussion, right? By generating the information. So we'll have something to talk about. Because if you have no data, you know, then everything is just a matter of opinion. There's really nothing to discuss. So we need to get this debate or this discussion into a point where we can have a more rational discussion of the whole topic.
Brilliant. I do have one objection, Gennady, and that's that people will clearly wanted to talk about the science with Greg of cryobiology and cryonics over the fascinating financial details that I could go on at length about. We could have spent the last 2.5 hours talking about the details of index universal life and the tax benefits and advantages, which would have been completely fascinating to at least one person on the planet, but maybe not everybody who's paying attention here. So I bow to the fact that we actually do love the science. The science needs to be there. But I want you to know the financial piece on this thing is certainly important as well. We did not cover the financial stability of the cryonics organizations. If we could take a minute and stipulate that, they are two main cryonics organizations we feel have good reason to believe are financially stable to go through the perturbations of deep time. But we'll have a whole new Salon about the fascinating financial piece, and I will not be offended that people clearly wanted to talk about science instead of finances.
Well, one question that might tie the two fields together is, can you successfully cryopreserve a life insurance policy?
We can't do that, but we may be able to successfully have your money go with you, which is a pretty huge deal. It turns out maybe not everybody on this particular broadcast, but it turns out in the big wide world where some of us kind of try to live from time to time, there's wealthy people, and interestingly enough, those wealthy people are often even more interested in finding a way to preserve their money before they even talk about preserving themselves, which is kind of getting the cart before the horse. But now, after 26 years of working on it, we've got some pretty good evidence to believe that we can structure programs that will have a reasonable chance of success. They sidestep the legal pitfalls that have been heretofore have been concerns about cryonics trust planning. Again, it's probably beyond the details we want to go on into here, although I'll be happy to talk about it because that's what the book we've just in process of publishing is about. There's some Non-issue concerns against, like rules against perpetuity, which some people are still worried about. That is a non-issue. There's some 17 states that don't have rules against perpetuity. The big factor is, do human beings in cryopreservation have personhood status? And the Cryonics trust protocols that we structure sidestep that question altogether. We're not trying to create new laws here. What we're trying to do is work with the existing laws so that these Cryonics trusts will work without court cases to say whether you are a person or not once you're pronounced dead in cryopreservation. So that is a important thing. We've got some structures that basically, just as Greg's been paying his dues for 40 years to bring back organs, I've been paying my dues for 42 years in the financial planning field and 26 years plus in the Cryonics financial planning field. And we've got some things that we have good reason to believe have a good possibility of working.
Rudi, I have a question for you. It comes up a lot because, as you know, I'm a big proponent of cryonics.
You are a major proponent. I've called this man Schindler from the platform because he basically has tried to save as many people as he could with cryonics.
Could I just ask you a question? Let me just ask a question. If we're done with the science, this might be a good time for me to ring out. I don't want to interrupt the conversation, but this is kind of beyond my realm right now.
Well, let's hear if Pavel has a question for Greg. Because if there is a scientific question based on anything that Greg has discussed, this may be a good opportunity to ask it. Let's see. Any questions from Pavel?
All right, I guess I've answered all the questions.
Yes, not.
So.
Hey, Greg,
Right, well,
Greg,
yes.
before you do leave, there is a little bit of a question I had for you. With
Okay.
regard to infusion, is it easier to infuse whole body or neuropreservations?
No, based on the experiments that we've done, it depends on how you do the latter, right? So we found that bilateral carotid perfusion, as we reported in the ASK paper, works very well, and that's a quick and simple procedure. Whereas going into the abdomen and the way we've done pigs, we found that we had to do both that and other cannulation elsewhere in the body and the abdomen. So I'd say that the brain preservation is easier than whole body preservation mechanically.
And that means better success rate then, possibly?
Well,
I mean,
I can't say that. I can't say that exactly. All I can say is it's harder to do.
okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that
Greg, thank you, man. Bravo.
All right.
Thank you very much,
thanks.
everybody. We needed covered. Thank you. We got that covered.
Okay.
And
Bye.
bye, Greg.
Yes, thank you to Dr. Greg Fahy for his insightful remarks on the science of cryobiology. We have learned a lot about the current state of the science, what is possible, what is not yet possible, some of the challenges and some of the promising results that hopefully we will see more about once they are published.
Thanks, Genevieve. Bye-bye. Take care.
Yeah.
All right, so now we can continue the discussion on some of the financial aspects related to cryonics. And Charlie, you wanted to ask Rudi a question. Feel free to do that. Charlie, I believe you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Rudi, my question was, and this comes up often, why is it that is Cryonics Institute is much cheaper than Alcor?
That's a reasonable question, Charlie. First of all, it's not actually as much cheaper as it might seem on first glance. Here's some quick numbers on the basic costs of cryopreservation. Alcor's full body cryopreservation is $200,000. Their neuro is $80,000. The Cryonics Institute, here after abbreviated CI, is theoretically $35,000 or $28,000 if you're a lifetime member. At first glance, that seems like a huge distinction, and that often causes that question to be asked. Those are kind of apples and oranges comparisons. It is now possible because the Cryonics Institute does have, because the transportation piece is not included with CI. If you just have CI, what they've done is break it out in a kind of a menu type situation. When somebody signs up with CI with Rudi Hoffman, what they get is the full package that includes Cryonics Institute, suspended animation, or ICE, cryotransport team cost, and private air ambulance. The global cost for those three with CI is $143,000 today. So the 143,000 and 200,000 is a lot closer and comparable. So that is one piece. The second is that both of those pieces do not have the big nuance factor, which is the increased cost that will be occurring in the future. Both CI and Alcor do not guarantee that you're grandfathered in at the rate that when you initially sign up. So it makes sense to have more coverage rather than less if you can afford it. That is why historically the actual back-tested growth or increase in cost, for instance, at Alcor, it's about 3.2%, roughly a doubling time every 23, 25 years or so. So the short answer is it's not that much of a distinction in cost if you actually include the full transportation piece. The other part of that, if I can continue responding to that question, Charlie, is that Alcor puts aside more money into the patient care trust fund every time they put someone in cryopreservation. They charge $200,000 for full body cryopreservation, and they put someone in. By the way, we just had one not too long ago. I guess had another about 2 weeks ago. I had a CI death benefit cryopreservation. A friend of mine who was about 100 kilometers from where I'm sitting. Anyway, but when CI put someone in cryopreservation, they put about $7,000 or $10,000 into the patient care trust fund. When Alcor, someone puts a full body in cryopreservation, it's more like $130,000. So it's a big distinction in how much money they're setting aside. That if we believe that we're trying to figure out the most secure, overfunded, solidly funded operation, that higher amount into the patient care trust fund is probably a good idea, which does not mean that CI is not a fine option. It just simply means that that is part of the distinction. They have a much lower overhead, and the whole operation is more, for lack of a better word, startup.
Well, you know what? That brings me to a follow-up now that you just mentioned something, and I'm sorry to hear about your friend, but I'm glad to hear that he was cryopreserved. You said he was a few hundred meters away from me or from you. Yeah. Why did he not go to Osiris? Are they still around? That's the cryopreservation.
Yeah, Osiris is a interesting situation. Osiris, to give you a quick backstory, is another Cryonics initiative in South Florida, developed by a single guy by the name of Devir Dirhi, DVIR Dirhi, and basically it's a little worrisome, quite frankly. It's one guy with no board of directors, no financial stability. It's very, plus he has also had not one but two felony arrests, which is not exactly ideal. One was for bribing an official, which he claims was simply a cultural issue. The second was much more problematic, he actually has a farm, and he was arrested for animal cruelty, which is really bad. And the situation was truly awful. There was a big, huge spread about it in the South Florida paper. When we had you recall, Charlie, you were at the Cryonics International Symposium, ICE, International Cryonics Symposium, that we had in South Florida. I actually asked Devir to not come. I did not want Dury there because he was controversial. Cryonics is in such a knife edge of credibility. What we don't need is an expose of a guy in South Florida who basically is running a Cryonics organization who was arrested for animal cruelty. And so, but by the way, he did come to the conference, and he did come to the conference anyway, but at least he had no official standing. I wish there was some mechanism for having a organizational international cryonics standards that basically potentially bad actors could be shoved to the side, because I think he probably would fall into that at this point in time. There has also been some fraudulent cryonics organizations that emerge from time to time. You know, cryonics is not big enough yet to have an immune system against these kind of entities, but I've tried to develop some initiatives that will have a cryonic standards society so that we can basically have some kind of international cooperation, so that if there are bad actors, we can say, hey, listen, this XYZ is a bad actor. They do not represent what cryonics is trying to do.
Thank you for that. By the way, any more information on TimeShip?
Ooh, that's a great question. TimeShip, as you probably know, is this phenomenal initiative. It's been around 15 or 20 years now. A great facility that's in southeast Texas, the rolling hills of Texas, not too far from San Antonio. Yes. We had some of you, let's see, I don't know if were you at the meeting we actually had out there, Chuck? I forget. I know you cut a lot of meetings. But basically, it's this.
I don't know.
It's at about 1,000 acres of rolling Texas hills. There's a huge mansion on the place right now. That is going to be the location for this magnificent cryonics facility to be called TimeShip, TIMESHIP. It's an initiative of, not surprisingly, Bill Falloon and Saul Kent, and technically it's under the auspices of the Stasis Foundation. And remarkably, that whole facility is owned free and clear. It's like a $25 million plus place. It's owned free and clear. What is not there, however, right now is a 50,000 place for 50,000 full body cryonicists that will eventually be there. It's a very long, slow moving initiative, but it's going to be huge, and it's going to basically generate a lot of positive publicity, we think, for cryonics, because we'll have state-of-the-art cryopreservation. We're not sure exactly what price point it's going to be at, but because it will be at the intermediate temperature storage option, which, as you may know, is cold enough to prevent biological damage, but warmer than the glass transition temperature that we did not talk about with Greg, which is basically the point at which even fully vitrified tissue has fracturing. So there's a mechanism of storage that Alcor is experimenting with that basically is about -125, -130 degrees, that enables us to store biological tissues, or us, without the fracturing that occurs to even fully vitrified tissues. So anyway, that is the plan for the TimeShip, is to use intermediate temperature storage and state-of-the-art storage. So we're not sure exactly where the price point's going to be there. Another reason to have more life insurance rather than less, if you can afford it.
Thank you.
So thank you, Rudi, for those answers. There's a related question from David Wood about various cryonics organizations, and he is asking, is there sufficient transparency about the finances of both Alcor and the Cryonics Institute that it can be confidently said that they are both long-term financially stable?
Wow, David, thank you. What a beautiful question that is. And to answer your question in a simple yes or no format, which you don't get from politicians and lawyers and scientists, is, well, it depends. But the answer with reference to Alcor and the CI is yes, absolutely. It's fully transparent. Literally on their website, both organizations, David, have their full assets and liabilities. In this case, both of them have pretty much zero liabilities. They're both fully paid for facilities. They own the physical plant, the doers, the technologies are all there. Basically, is owned. It's all free and clear owned. That is one component of stability. The other component of stability, and again, it's fully disclosed on the Alcor site as well as CI site, which are the Cryonics Institute. Also, I attend both of their annual meetings, and of course, you're welcome to encourage to come. CI, for instance, has an annual general meeting, membership meeting every fall. This year, of course, was virtual. Chuck, you and I have been up there at those. They're really great fun, and here's what's cool. You don't have to be an Alcor member or CI member or even a Cryonics member to come. You're welcome to come. And they literally pass out the full assets and liabilities, what the what growth occurred on the patient care trust, what their basically what their long-term stability is. And the long-term stability of both these organizations has been worked on for literally decades. A lot of very smart people who have tried to figure out, hey, what can go wrong? How can we make sure that these organizations have the longevity we need for the not just multi-decade, but maybe multi-century period of time they need to be stable? And that is one of the most profound, deep questions about cryonics. I do go into a little bit of that in this book, by the way, which is because it's really one of the most insightful questions. Even if the cryonics biologically works, if the organizations are not stable financially, if they're not structured in a manner that they can be there through thick and thin, through weird societal perturbations, even through weird things like Trump, and hopefully not Trump getting another 4 years. But anyway, the reality is over deep time, we know that weird stuff happens. The cryonics organizations, both Alcor and CI, have spent a great deal of time and money trying to see how can we be stable. Now that is in contrast to the other organizations, to be fair. CryoRoost right now is a really weird disaster that no one quite knows about. CryoRoost is, they're in a civil war. Basically, the people who own the doers are at war with the people who own the organization, and they've somehow managed to get in a big fuss, which is embarrassing and awkward and gives us a cautionary tale about how even the best of intentions can go bad if there's not a lot of over-engineering on the social structure and the structure of organizations. Hopefully that was a helpful response. The reality is no one knows for sure. Interesting point of information, we do know that, for instance, that Benjamin Franklin put 1,000 pounds basically into a long-term trust for his two favorite cities, Boston and Philadelphia, and that those actually survived, and they have just recently been decanted and spewed out several millions of dollars. So it is possible for structures to last for extended periods of time if they're well structured.
Yes, indeed. And financial structures to some extent have more open-ended longevity than human organisms at this time. I will say, as an aside, I was somewhat facetious in my remark that the C. elegans worm's ability to essentially recover fairly well from a cryopreservation gives me a certain degree of envy, because despite the ability of C. elegans worms to recover from cryopreservation and also be the beneficiaries of significant life extension, I think up to 10-fold in some experiments, their absolute lifespans are still pitifully short, and they can live for several tens of days, and with certain life extending treatments that can be prolonged. But of course, humans today can live for 8, 9, 10, up to 12 decades if we're fortunate. And I think this complexity of our organisms, it enables us to survive for a much longer period of time. But on the other hand, it has these drawbacks that we're not as versatile as the simpler creatures of this world. But we are able to make long-term plans, far longer term than the time horizon of the C. elegans worm, to be sure. And it's good to have Rudi here to talk about some of these aspects. Now, we have an interesting question from our allied member, Kelvin Dafiagor from Nigeria. He's very interested in lifting up the potentialities of his fellow Africans. And he's wondering, how can this wonderful technology be made available to poor people in Africa? So do you foresee a path in the future where cryopreservation will become a sufficiently widespread and affordable option that even poor people in Africa would be able to access it?
Brilliant question. And the answer is, over time, yes, I think it will eventually. Cryopreservation like other medical technologies, will eventually democratize and become much more accessible and eventually be a standard of care that will be provided ideally to everyone on the planet. But we know there's a clear path. This amazing piece of technology here, of course, is something that would not have been affordable by a kings and queens some few decades ago, or even governments couldn't have afforded the kind of thing that this does. But over time, technologies get better, they get cheaper, they get more accessible, they become democratized, and there's a clear path for other things like this doing this. Now, medical technologies are a little different. The economies of scale we're going to need to get for cryonics to go become cheaper instead of more expensive is probably going to take quite some time. And I wish here, related to that very idea is the fact that right now, I at one time I could write life insurance for people who were in England, people who are in Europe, people who are in some in Africa, in most reasonably developed countries. The insurance companies have now changed that, and basically I can only write life insurance for US based people. We cannot even do Canada and Mexico anymore. Part of the nationalistic nonsense that's kind of going on. But eventually these ideas, cryonics will democratize. I don't know when. So take care of yourself, take as many of us who are involved in cryonics realize this is not the end of the game. It's a plan B. And if we're young enough, we simply want to continue to live for as long as we can. And it's important to understand that this is not at odds with anti-aging, with age reversal. This is this is of a same piece. The very people who are activists in anti-aging and age reversal and anti-aging science are also signed up with cryonics. So this is not at odds with trying to find a way to live. It's on the same side of that table. It's another technology that you should be taking advantage of.
Yes, indeed. And one of our viewers, Sans Satori, asks, Rudi, do you have any links or further reading regarding the cryonics trusts that you mentioned? And if you do, please feel free to share, and we can again update the video description when those are available.
Yeah, that's a good, I would be happy to send you as in Gennady, you could put the whole link up the PDF of this book, which is my first book. And that's basically on the ideas of cryonics, the mechanics of the process of signing up, the finances, the options between the two cryonics organizations. It's put in a readable story format to make it easy to read, but basically it has all those contents about how you basically turn this thing from an interesting idea to actually getting it physically done, getting that bracelet on your wrist. But the other book that I'm close to being published, if you would like, Gennady, I'd be happy to send you I don't know if we could do this mechanics wise, but I could send you the link to it's in Google Docs right now. If I send you the Google Docs link, and because basically I want these ideas out in the memosphere. My bread is buttered on people actually executing on these ideas, not thinking about them. That means I don't need the $3 I make if you buy this off Amazon. I don't need the $4 you'd buy if you buy my next book off Amazon. I want the ideas out there, so I'm happy to send them out for free. And so basically, I'll be happy to send you the link to the PDF of this book to you, and if you can make that available on the website or whatever, that'd be super. Is that responsive to the question?
Yes, I would be happy to make those links available once you provide them. So I think now we've had a fascinating conversation for almost 3 hours and 10 minutes, and I think it's time to delve into our closing statements from each of the U.S. Transhumanist Party panelists, and then, as is our custom, we will let our guest, Rudi Hoffman, have the final word. So who among the officers would like to provide closing statements?
I can go first.
All right.
first, yeah, I'm so sad that I have to miss the scientific part of the stream, but let's talk economics and other soft part. Actually, I have a first, yes, Rudi, thank you so much for the work you're doing. I think it's important for transhumanists to use existing interfaces which society provides us to get access to this far-fetched future we all dream about. So work you do with the economic stuff and insurance to get cryonic accessible, it's very important. I have a question about you start talking about how wealthy people care about their wealth in the future more than they care about their lives, and that lead me to thinking about the legal status of the cryonic patients. Like, as I understand now, it's clarify if it's true. As I understand now, a cryonic patient considered as like biological material stored in a facility. And what do you think? How do you think we can secure the human rights of the cryonic patients while they are not considered as people? And how can we change this fact? And yeah, thank you so much for coming in.
Certainly, and thank you, Pavel. That whole the right now, when you are, in order to be cryopreserved, you actually have to be pronounced dead by a medical professional. Obviously, we know that does not mean you're necessarily irretrievably dead, but it does mean that somebody in the medical profession has said that you are dead. And right now, the dead don't have rights. You're basically like in the Monty Python sketch, you're an ex-person, not an ex-parrot. Anybody get that reference? Somebody smile. The next
Yes.
parrot when they're pounding in on the table. But first of all, the most cryonics organizations actually operate under the Uniform Gift of Organs Act. Basically, you're a biological donation for science, which again another reason to see this as a altruistic activity. This is not selfish yuppies freezing themselves. This is smart people doing the good for science. At the same time, your donation is you, and the cryonics organizations basically protect their patients. We call them patients. I'm not sure we're likely to change the actual legal status for some time. That's going to take some court cases. But what we can do is make sure that the cryonics organizations have the structures in place and the finances in place and the people and the attitudes in place that basically where they will go to the wall psychologically, legally to protect their patients. And I think both CI and Alcor certainly have proven in the past they're willing to do that. So I think that is our guarantee of, or not guarantee, but the reason that we have reasons to trust the process may work.
Thank you, Rudi, for that response and a great question by Pavel. Now let's see if Charlie has closing statements.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can
gotcha.
hear you.
Oh, good. I think I was having trouble with the audio. And a little bit of a question, Rudi. If you're signed up with a, you were talking before about the having the policy owned. You get a policy, for example, like what you did with Dawn, and then later on you switched it from you being the beneficiary to the Cryonics or to Alcor, whichever one. What if can you switch? Like, let's say you made Alcor your Cryonics policy holder, but then you say, you know what, I want to switch over to Cryonics Institute. You still maintain that control, right? I mean, that's something you would have.
Yeah, that is absolutely great. And as a matter of fact, that happens all the time. We have people switching vendors, and that's important when we're getting signed up. It's important to realize you don't have to make a decision that's permanent. You're making a decision provisionally based on the facts on the ground right now. What some people do is sign up with CI initially because their membership dues which are in addition to and separate from your life insurance premiums. The membership dues at the Cryonics Institute are $120 a year. The membership dues at Alcor are $550 a year, which is a significant distinction for many people. So what some people do, especially if they're on the eastern part of the United States and or more cost conscious, is buy enough life insurance to eventually switch to Alcor, but sign up with CI right now because they're about $400 a year cheaper in dues. So it is indeed easy to change. It's just that is just a matter of a couple of sheets of paper. Yes, everyone has to sign off on it. You can't do it without, you have to when you're changing from CI to Alcor, you have to let them know. But it's seamless. It's done via scanned PDF change of beneficiary and change of ownership forms. Is that responsive to your question, Chuck?
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate that. And I just wanted to close by saying thanks for coming on. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talk. And I love hanging out with you when I can. But
I love hanging out with you, Chuck.
Now it's virtual.
And next time I went out with Chuck, and Chuck he took me out to go bar hopping, but somehow or other my credit card got put with the barman, and that's the last I saw it. I remember asking for a long time.
That's because I've brought you more customers than anybody on the planet.
Well, that's true. So I'm happy to have that happen. Chuck has been phenomenal. He's been a great supporter.
All right. Thank you to Charlie and Rudy. Now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia for his closing statements, questions, comments, anything.
No additional questions, but thanks for coming, Rudy, and getting us all that good info. So definitely something to think about. And thank you.
Thank you, Art.
Excellent. And now Dan Elton.
I don't have any additional questions, but again, thanks for coming on and for organizing Greg Fahy's appearance here, because
wasn't
that was extremely
I love that guy.
educational.
I have loved him for decades. He's just phenomenal.
Yeah, I think I learned more there than any other time, and it's such a compressed 2 hours or whatever it was. And I'm actually very excited now about the prospects of cryopreservation research. Sounds like there's a lot of potential there. So that's something I'm going to be, pushing for however I can. And I think something the Transhumanist Party should advocate very strongly for. So I think this was a really great salon, and thanks again for coming on.
All right, thank you, Dan. And now we will conclude with the final word from our guest, Rudi Hoffman.
All right. Well, you guys have hung tough. My goodness, 3 hours and 18 minutes. No wonder you guys are going to take over the world, because you're simply willing to pay us bigger dues than other folks. Sometimes you just got to do your homework. I tell people that when they're looking into cryonics, there's simply no substitute for doing a little bit of reading, read a few books, hop on the internet, get some feedback about what kind of experience people had. There is simply no substitute for doing your homework, and you guys have done that, which I really appreciate. So from my heart to yours, I would encourage you to check out cryonics. It's part of being a transhumanist. It's a foundational thing. Your timing is perfect. My batteries are about to go in my earphones. I think I'm here and beeping. So I'm going to say thank you very much to you folk, wonderful people, and I'm going to sign out.
All right, thank you to our guest, Rudi Hoffman, and thank you to all of our viewers of this virtual Enlightenment Salon. This is the kind of high quality, educational, scientific, philosophical, and at times entertaining conversation that we aim to have every Sunday at our virtual Enlightenment Salons. So please keep tuning in and attending our salons. We will have them every Sunday from now until the foreseeable future. And until then, live long and prosper.
See you in the future, folks.
Live long and prosper.
Bye.
Yes. See you in the future.